I am Calvin Hayes, 69 years old, and a retired contractor who just learned that flesh and blood means absolutely nothing when money is involved. My son and his wife decided I was taking up too much space in the home I built with my own hands. So they slid a lease across the dining table demanding $1,500 a month for me to live in my own basement. I did not yell. I just signed it, bought a $2 million lake house in cash, and vanished in the middle of the night. What happened to them next was a financial bloodbath. Before I continue this story, let me know which state or country you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect cannot be bought, but disrespect must be punished. The crisp white printer paper slid across the heavy glass dining table with a harsh, scraping sound. It stopped right next to my cup of black coffee. I looked down at it. It was a standard residential lease agreement clearly downloaded straight off the internet. At the top of the page, in bold black letters, it stated a monthly rent requirement of $1,500. I slowly lifted my eyes from the document. Chelsea, my son Terrence's wife, sat directly across from me with her arms crossed tightly over her expensive designer blouse. Her posture was rigid and her expression was completely blank. She did not even blink as I stared at her. Terrence was sitting next to her and was suddenly very interested in the glowing screen of his smartphone. He was scrolling aimlessly through nothing, desperately refusing to meet my gaze. The silence in the dining room was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the hallway clock. This was the house I framed, wired, and paid off in full over 30 years of exhausting physical labor. I gave the deed to Terrence 3 years ago as a wedding gift so the two of them could start their new life together completely debt-free. Now I was being handed an extortion note disguised as a legal rental agreement in my own home. Chelsea tapped her manicured fingernail against the glass table, breaking the silence. She told me I needed to read the document carefully because the first payment was due on Friday. I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at my son. I asked Terrence if this was his idea. He finally looked up, shifting uncomfortably in his premium leather dining chair. He cleared his throat and mumbled a weak excuse about the current state of the economy. He said property taxes in our Atlanta suburb were going up rapidly. Inflation was hitting their bank accounts hard, and maintaining a house of this massive size required two steady and substantial incomes. He told me the market was tough right now and that everyone living under the roof had to pull their own weight. It was a perfectly rehearsed corporate speech. I could easily tell Chelsea had made him practice it in their bedroom before they called me upstairs. I kept my voice low and calm. I reminded him that they had absolutely no mortgage to pay because I handed them the property completely free and clear. I reminded him that I paid for my own groceries, washed my own laundry, and only occupied the finished basement out of sight. Chelsea leaned forward abruptly, her eyes narrowing with intense frustration. She told me I was completely out of touch with modern reality. She said heating the basement cost them extra money every month. My long morning showers drove up the water bill, and my mere presence in the house was a heavy, emotional burden on their marriage. She said they were young, successful professionals trying to maintain a certain high-class lifestyle, and that having a retired old man living beneath them for free was severely draining their resources. Then she called me a freeloader. The word hung in the quiet air like a foul odor. A freeloader. I had worked 50-hour weeks carrying heavy lumber and pouring concrete since I was 19 years old. I built a highly successful contracting business from the ground up through pure sweat and determination. I wore faded flannel shirts and drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, not because I was broke, but because I deeply knew the true value of a hard-earned dollar. Terrence and Chelsea drove luxury imported vehicles they leased on maximum credit and wore designer clothes they could not afford, just to impress neighbors they did not even like. They looked at my calloused hands and simple boots and genuinely thought I was just a poor old black man surviving on a meager Social Security check. They had absolutely no idea I still held silent, highly profitable partnerships in 2 major commercial development firms in the state of Georgia. They assumed my quiet modesty was a sign of pathetic poverty. Terrence chimed in again, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of the moment. He said Chelsea was entirely right, and that $1,500 was actually a steep family discount compared to what a luxury basement apartment would rent for in our prestigious zip code. He told me I should be grateful they were not asking for $2,000 a month. The disrespect was not just in the demand for money. It was in the arrogant assumption that I was foolish, desperate, and trapped. They genuinely believed I had nowhere else to go and no resources to fight back. Most fathers would have exploded right then and there. Most men would have flipped the glass dining table, shouted about betrayal, and aggressively demanded their house back. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not show even a tiny ounce of anger on my face. Decades of laying brick and pouring deep foundations had taught me that emotion makes you sloppy, and I have never been a sloppy builder. I slowly reached into the inside breast pocket of my faded work jacket and pulled out my heavy silver fountain pen. I clicked the cap off with a sharp and deliberate snap. I smoothed the cheap printer paper out with the calloused palm of my hand. I looked directly into Chelsea's cold eyes as I pressed the ink nib to the signature line at the bottom of the page. I signed my full legal name in a slow, steady, and perfectly legible script. I wrote down the current date next to it. Then I calmly pushed the paper back across the glass table toward her. I told them that if $1,500 a month was the strict price of keeping a roof over my head, I would gladly pay it without another complaint. Chelsea snatched the paper off the table with a triumphant, mocking smirk. She folded it neatly and told me she expected a certified cashier's check by the first morning of every single month. I put my silver pen back in my pocket and slowly stood up from the table. I looked down at both of them and made one very simple condition. I told them that as a fully paying tenant, I legally required a formal signed and dated receipt for every single payment I made to them. I said I needed it to keep my personal financial records in order. Terrence nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that the confrontation was finally over without a massive screaming match. Chelsea rolled her eyes dramatically and said writing a simple receipt was the absolute least she could do for my money. She smiled because she thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied an exhausted old man into permanently funding her reckless shopping habits. She had absolutely no idea that her arrogant demand for rent had just violated a highly specific hidden trust deed I quietly attached to the property transfer 3 years ago. That little monthly receipt she just promised to write was not for my personal records. It was the exact piece of physical, undeniable evidence my ruthless lawyer needed to completely and legally destroy them. The sharp sound of shattering glass and heavy wood violently hitting the staircase jolted me awake before the sun even came up. I rushed out of my bed and stepped into the narrow basement hallway just in time to see my heavy winter boots tumbling down the wooden steps. A cardboard box followed immediately after, spilling my favorite hardcover books and personal bathroom supplies all over the cold concrete floor at my feet. Then came the unmistakable crash of something delicate breaking. I looked up the steep staircase. Chelsea was standing at the very top landing with her hands resting aggressively on her hips. She was breathing heavily, as if she had just finished a strenuous workout. She kicked a stray pile of my folded winter sweaters down the steps with the tip of her expensive silk slipper. The clothes cascaded down and landed in a messy heap next to my boots. I did not shout. I did not ask her what she was doing. I simply stood there in the dim light of the basement and watched my own daughter-in-law violently purge the last remaining traces of my existence from the upper floors of my own home. Chelsea glared down at me with absolute disgust. She did not bother to lower her voice. She announced that her parents were flying in from upstate New York this coming weekend and they would be staying in the guest bedroom for an entire month. She said her mother had highly refined tastes and a very sensitive nervous system that could not handle any unnecessary disruptions. Because of this, she was establishing new ground rules effective immediately. I was officially banned from stepping foot on the ground floor or the second floor for the next 30 days. I was not allowed to use the main kitchen to cook my meals. I was not allowed to use the upstairs laundry room to wash my clothes. I was not allowed to walk through the front door or the main living room under any circumstances. If I needed to leave the house, I was required to use the rusty side door that led directly from the basement into the muddy side yard. She spoke to me as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into her pristine mansion and soiled her expensive carpets. I shifted my gaze past Chelsea and saw Terrence standing silently in the hallway behind her. He was holding a cup of steaming coffee and wearing his tailored suit for work. He refused to make eye contact with me. He just stared at the blank wall, pretending he did not hear his wife treating his father like a heavily infected quarantine patient. I asked Terrence directly if he was going to let her speak to me this way in the house I built and gave to them. Terrence let out a long sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. He stepped forward slightly but stayed safely behind his wife. He said Chelsea was under a lot of stress preparing for her parents to arrive and that I needed to be accommodating. He said his in-laws were accustomed to a certain standard of living and seeing a renter wandering around the kitchen in work boots would make them highly uncomfortable. He actually used the word renter. He looked me in the eye and told me to just buy a cheap microwave for the basement and heat up canned soup until they left. He said it was a small sacrifice to keep the peace in his household. The sheer cowardice in his voice was thicker than the dust settling on the stairs. He had completely sold his soul and his dignity to a woman who viewed us both as nothing more than walking bank accounts. Chelsea smiled a tight, victorious smile. She told me the main door at the top of the stairs would be permanently locked from the outside starting tonight. She turned around and walked away without waiting for a response. Terrence quickly followed her like an obedient servant trailing his master. I stood alone at the bottom of the staircase, surrounded by my scattered belongings. I slowly bent down to pick up the item that had caused the loud crash earlier. It was a silver picture frame. Inside was a faded photograph of my late wife Evelyn holding Terrence when he was just a newborn baby. The heavy glass covering her beautiful smiling face was completely shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. A sharp shard of glass sliced into my thumb as I gently wiped the debris away from Evelyn's face. A single drop of my blood fell onto the concrete floor. I did not feel any physical pain. I only felt a cold and absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I carefully tucked the photograph into the pocket of my shirt. I did not clean up the mess on the floor. I walked up the stairs, grabbed the heavy wooden door leading to the main house and pulled it shut. The loud click of the lock turning from the other side echoed through the stairwell. They thought they were locking me in. They did not realize they were locking themselves in a cage with a ticking bomb. I walked back down the stairs and sat on the edge of my simple mattress. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. Robert Mitchell answered on the second ring. His deep, commanding voice filled the tiny speaker. I did not bother with any pleasantries or small talk. I told Robert it was time to initiate the financial audit we had prepared for emergencies. I instructed him to dig into every single bank account, credit card, auto loan, and business expense tied to Terrence and Chelsea. I wanted to know their exact debt-to-income ratio. I wanted to know every late payment, every hidden line of credit, and every single financial vulnerability they had desperately tried to hide behind their designer clothes and leased cars. Robert chuckled darkly on the other end of the line. He said he would have a comprehensive destruction package ready for my review in less than 24 hours. I hung up the phone. Terrence and Chelsea wanted to lock me in the basement and demand $1,500 a month. They were about to learn exactly how much it cost to cross a man who built everything they stood on. I stepped out of the bright afternoon sun and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the most exclusive real estate brokerage in the Buckhead district of Atlanta. The air conditioning hit me instantly. The lobby smelled of expensive leather and citrus room spray. The room was a massive expanse of polished white marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I was wearing the exact same faded canvas work jacket and scuffed steel toe boots that Chelsea so deeply despised. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman wearing a wireless headset and a sharply tailored designer suit. She looked up from her computer monitor with a warm, professional smile. That smile vanished the absolute second her eyes landed on my mud-stained boots. She looked me up and down, her nose wrinkled slightly as if I had dragged actual garbage into her pristine sanctuary. She asked me if I was lost, or if I was here to fix the plumbing in the guest restrooms. I did not answer her. I walked right past her desk without saying a single word and headed straight for the glass-walled office of the senior broker I had researched on my phone during the taxi ride over. I pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking. A young man with perfectly slicked-back hair and a custom-fitted navy blue suit was sitting behind a massive oak desk. His gold nameplate read Julian. He was a senior luxury agent. Julian looked up from his tablet. His perfectly groomed eyebrows shot up in pure disbelief. He immediately stood up and held his hand out not to shake mine, but to block me from taking another step into his office. He used that smooth, condescending tone people reserve for confused children or people asking for spare change on the street. He told me the public restrooms were down the hall and to the left. He said I needed to wait outside in the lobby if I was looking for directions to the nearest bus stop. I ignored his outstretched hand. I pulled one of his heavy leather guest chairs back and sat down right in front of him. I leaned back and crossed my arms over my chest. I told him I was not looking for a bathroom and I did not ride the bus. I told him I was looking to purchase a primary residence today, specifically a luxury lakefront property in the northern suburbs. Julian let out a short, arrogant laugh. He slowly sat back down and steepled his fingers together on the desk. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and supreme annoyance. He explained slowly, over articulating his words, that his agency exclusively handled ultra-luxury properties. He said their portfolio only included homes that started at $1.5 million. He said they did not handle government-subsidized housing, cheap monthly rentals, or mobile home parks. He literally looked me in the eye and told me I would have much better luck checking the classified ads in the local newspaper or driving out to a rural county where the dirt was cheaper. He reached for his desk phone. He was clearly intending to call building security to have me forcibly escorted out of the lobby. I did not raise my voice. I did not get angry. Decades in the contracting business taught me to let the money do the screaming. I reached into the inside pocket of my faded jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a certified bank statement from my primary wealth management account. I slammed it down flat on the center of his pristine oak desk. I told him to read the bottom line before he picked up that telephone. Julian froze. He looked highly irritated by my aggressive movement, but his eyes naturally drifted down to the piece of paper. I sat in silence and watched his pupils dilate. I watched the healthy pink color completely drain from his perfectly tanned face. He blinked rapidly. He leaned closer to the paper as if he genuinely thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The bottom line clearly showed an available liquid cash balance of over $8 million, and that was just one of my many business accounts. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face instantly. It was replaced by a look of sheer panic and overwhelming greed. His hands actually started shaking as he looked up at me. The transformation was sickening, but highly effective. Suddenly, I was no longer a confused old man in dirty boots. Suddenly, I was Mr. Hayes, his most valued and deeply respected client. He began stammering out a frantic apology. He claimed he had just been having a highly stressful morning and had completely misjudged the situation. He scrambled to open his top desk drawer. He pulled out glossy property brochures and offered me imported sparkling water. He said he had several unlisted lakefront estates that would perfectly suit a man of my obvious distinction. I held up my calloused hand to silence his pathetic groveling. I told him I did not need his water, and I certainly did not need his apologies. I told him I needed a house, I needed it empty, and I needed the keys in my hand by tomorrow afternoon at the absolute latest. Julian frantically swiped at his tablet. His fingers were trembling with the excitement of the massive commission he was about to make. He spun the screen around to show me a stunning modern villa located right on the edge of a private lake. It had massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a private boat dock, a wraparound wooden deck, and 5 spacious bedrooms. The asking price was $2 million. The current owners had already relocated to Europe for work, and the house was sitting completely vacant. It was fully staged with high-end modern furniture. I looked at the photos for exactly 30 seconds. It was quiet, isolated, and incredibly secure. I tapped my rough finger against the glass screen. I told him I would take it exactly as it was, including all the staging furniture currently inside the property. Julian gasped slightly. He started rambling about securing a premium mortgage rate and contacting his preferred network of luxury lenders to get the paperwork started. I cut him off immediately. I reached back into my jacket, pulled out my checkbook, and clicked my silver fountain pen. I told him there would be no banks involved. I told him there would be no mortgages and absolutely no 30-day waiting periods. I was paying the entire $2 million in straight cash right across his desk. The paperwork was pushed through with terrifying speed. Money talks, but a massive pile of verified cash absolutely screams in the real estate world. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the title company had cleared the massive wire transfer from my wealth manager. Julian was personally handing me a set of heavy brass keys with a trembling, sweaty hand. I walked out of the Buckhead brokerage, a brand new homeowner leaving the slick luxury agent bowing practically to the floor. I got back into my 10-year-old pickup truck and immediately made my second phone call of the day. I contacted a specialized premium moving service that guaranteed absolute discretion and after-hours operations. I paid them triple their normal rate for an emergency rush job. I gave them Terrence and Chelsea address and instructed them to arrive at exactly 2 in the morning. I wanted absolute silence. I wanted military precision. Tonight, my ungrateful son and his arrogant wife were going to sleep soundly in their stolen master bedroom, thinking they had successfully conquered an old man. Tomorrow morning, they were going to wake up to a ghost, and the financial nightmare of their miserable lives was going to officially begin. The antique grandfather clock in the upstairs hallway chimed twice. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead silent, swallowed by the heavy darkness of the early morning hours. Outside my side basement door, three massive men dressed entirely in black moved with the silent, ruthless efficiency of a highly trained military strike team. I had contacted a premium underground moving service that specialized in high-profile, discreet relocations. I paid them triple their standard premium rate in crisp cash for absolute silence, and they delivered perfectly. They wrapped my heavy oak dresser in thick padded moving blankets and carried it up the grassy slope to the unmarked black box truck parked out on the dark street. They did not speak a single word to each other. They communicated entirely through sharp hand signals and quick nods. Inside the main house, Terrence and Chelsea were fast asleep in their luxurious master bedroom directly above us. They were dreaming in their expensive silk sheets, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial foundation was currently being boxed up, carried out the door, and loaded into the back of a moving van. I stood perfectly still in the center of the rapidly emptying basement, holding a single cardboard box. It contained my most important legal documents, my bank statements, and the shattered picture frame holding the photograph of my late wife. The professional movers stripped the basement down to the bare concrete walls in under 45 minutes. Once they carried the last heavy mattress out the door, I quietly asked the foreman to wait for me by the truck. I stood alone in the center of the empty room. The silence was heavy and deeply profound. I looked down at the smooth concrete floor beneath my boots. I remembered the exact summer month over 30 years ago when I poured that cement with my own two bare hands. I remembered carrying the heavy wooden support beams down the steep stairs one by one. My shoulders ached and my hands were constantly blistered, but I pushed through the physical pain because I wanted to build a strong home. I wanted to build a fortress strong enough to protect my family for generations to come. I framed every single wall in this house. I installed every copper water pipe. I ran every electrical wire through the ceiling. I built this house with the purest intention of creating a warm, loving, and safe haven. Now it had become a cold, hostile prison guarded by my own ungrateful son and a woman who actively despised my very existence. I walked over to the small wooden table I had specifically instructed the movers to leave behind in the very center of the room. I reached into my thick jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key that opened the side door. I placed it gently on the center of the scratched wooden surface. Next to the key, I placed a single sheet of crisp white printer paper. I did not write a long emotional letter. I did not express my deep disappointment as a father, nor did I beg for an apology. I only wrote 2 short, direct sentences using my silver fountain pen. The dark blue ink flowed smoothly across the page. I wrote, "Lease terminated, effective immediately, handle your own mortgage from now on." I stood there and stared at the note for a few long seconds. There was absolutely no sadness left in my heart. There was only the cold, sharp, and unwavering focus of a man who was surgically removing a highly toxic and cancerous tumor from his life. I turned around, walked out the side door into the cool night air, and locked it securely behind me. I climbed into the passenger seat of my old pickup truck, which one of the movers had agreed to drive to my new $2 million lake house, and we pulled away into the dark night. I did not look back in the rearview mirror even once. Fast forward to the morning of the first day of the month. The bright morning sun was shining through the large, expensive windows of the upper floors. Down in the basement stairwell, heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed loudly against the walls. It was Chelsea. She marched down the wooden steps with a highly smug and entitled expression firmly planted on her face. She was fully expecting to collect her monthly extortion money to fund her lavish lifestyle. She pounded her small fist aggressively against the heavy basement door. She shouted my name loudly and demanded her $1,500 in straight cash or a certified bank check, exactly as she had ruthlessly dictated. She waited for my submissive response. Only absolute hollow silence answered her. She pounded on the thick wood again, her voice rising in sharp irritation. Finally, losing her patience, she grabbed the brass doorknob and shoved the door open. She stepped into the room and completely froze in her tracks. Her jaw dropped open in pure shock. The basement was entirely empty. There was no bed, no clothing, no books, and absolutely no trace of the old man she thought she had successfully bullied and trapped. The only object left in the massive, echoing room was the small wooden table sitting under the single overhead light bulb. Chelsea slowly walked over to the table and picked up the piece of paper resting next to the brass key. She read the 2 short sentences out loud to the empty room. Her voice trembled violently as the crushing, terrifying reality of the situation finally hit her. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and ran frantically back up the stairs, clutching the paper tightly in her shaking hand. She burst into the modern kitchen where Terrence was casually sipping his morning espresso. She shoved the note hard into his chest, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had packed up and abandoned them in the middle of the night. Terrence snatched the paper and recognized my steady handwriting. The healthy color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His ceramic coffee mug slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered into a dozen pieces on the expensive hardwood floor. The $1,500 they tried to extort from me was not just extra spending money for Chelsea to buy luxury shoes. It was the exact amount they were desperately short on their massive secret bank loan this month. Without my money, their account was going to overdraw by noon, and their carefully constructed fake wealthy lifestyle was about to violently and publicly collapse. Terrence stared at his shattered ceramic coffee mug on the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. Then he completely snapped. He slammed his open palm down on the expensive granite kitchen island so hard the hanging pendant lights rattled above them. He spun around and screamed right into Chelsea, his voice cracking with pure panic and suppressed rage. He told her she had completely ruined everything with her endless greed and her desperate need to play a wealthy socialite. He screamed that my $1,500 a month was the only thing standing between them and a massive financial default on their secret bank loan. He finally confessed to her that he was drowning in hidden debt trying to maintain their fake lifestyle. Without my silent financial support, the bank was going to freeze their primary checking account by noon today. Their luxury car payments would bounce. The premium credit cards they used to buy her designer clothes and expensive dinners would be instantly declined. Terrence paced back and forth across the kitchen, tearing at his neatly styled hair. He blamed her entirely for treating me like a stray dog until I finally bit back and left them with absolutely nothing. He told her she just threw away their only safety net because she was too arrogant to show a little basic respect. Chelsea refused to back down or accept even a single ounce of responsibility. Her face turned bright red as she shouted right back at him. She claimed she was only trying to establish boundaries in her own house and that a grown man should not have to rely on his retired father to pay his bills. She told Terrence to stop acting like a pathetic coward and figure out a way to replace the missing cash before her wealthy parents arrived this weekend. She absolutely refused to let her mother and father walk into a home facing imminent foreclosure. She aggressively crossed her arms and glared down the hallway toward the open basement door. That was when a desperate and highly reckless idea crossed her mind. She turned to Terrence and told him they had an entire empty floor sitting right underneath them doing nothing. She decided right then and there to turn my former living space into an illegal short-term rental. Terrence panicked even more. He argued weakly that they did not have the proper city permits, the required insurance, or the zoning approval to run a commercial hotel out of a quiet residential neighborhood. Chelsea told him to shut up and stop being so paranoid about rules. She grabbed her smartphone, marched down the wooden stairs, and snapped several quick photos of the empty concrete room. She quickly dragged an old, deflated air mattress from the garage, threw it on the cold floor, and created an online listing on a popular rental application. She advertised the space as a private, industrial chic underground loft. Because they were so desperately in need of immediate cash to cover the bank draft, she priced the nightly rate ridiculously low and manually turned off all the standard background checks for potential guests. She wanted money in hand today, regardless of who it came from. Her reckless desperation brought immediate and disastrous results. Within 3 hours, the underground listing was booked for an entire week by a user with no profile picture and a highly suspicious fake-sounding name. Chelsea did not care at all. The booking application released the initial payment directly to her bank account, narrowly saving them from the noon bank overdraft Terrence had been crying about. But her brief moment of victory vanished the exact second the sun went down. At 8 o'clock that evening, a rusted van with a loud broken muffler pulled directly onto their perfectly manicured front lawn, completely ignoring the paved driveway. 4 rough-looking men piled out of the vehicle. They were carrying heavy black duffel bags and smelled strongly of cheap alcohol and stale cigarette smoke. Chelsea watched through the living room window blinds, her heart pounding with sudden terror. She had invited complete strangers into her home without a single security precaution or background check. By 10 o'clock, 3 more strange cars parked illegally on the street and more sketchy individuals piled into the side door leading down to the basement. Terrence hid upstairs in the master bedroom with the door locked, too terrified to go down there and confront the crowd of intimidating men trespassing on his property. By midnight, the situation escalated from a poor financial decision to an absolute living nightmare. The heavy thumping bass of aggressive music shook the hardwood floors of the main level so hard the picture frames on the walls vibrated. The noise was deafening and relentless. The sharp, unmistakable stench of illegal narcotics and burnt marijuana wafted up through the shared air conditioning vents, filling Terrence and Chelsea's expensive bedroom with a sickening odor. Down in the basement, people were shouting loudly, breaking glass bottles against the concrete floor and slamming heavily against the walls I had carefully framed years ago. Chelsea sat on the edge of her luxury bed, trembling violently, while Terrence paced the room completely paralyzed by fear. They had successfully kicked out a quiet old man who paid his own way and kept the house pristine, only to replace him with a chaotic, drug-fueled party that was actively destroying their property from the inside out. They were essentially held hostage in their own house, too scared to even walk down the stairs to get a glass of water from their own kitchen. The $1,500 Chelsea proudly secured was now costing them their safety and their sanity. The deafening noise and chaos did not just stay confined to the walls of their property. Next door, an older gentleman who served as the highly strict president of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association was violently awakened by the shaking of his own bedroom windows. He threw on his heavy robe and stepped out onto his front porch. He looked over and saw the illegal parking tearing up the grass, the empty liquor bottles being thrown onto the pristine sidewalks, and the blatant illegal activity spilling out of Terrence's side door into the quiet suburban night. The older neighbor did not bother calling the local police dispatcher for a simple noise complaint. He knew that would only result in a minor warning. He knew exactly how to inflict maximum legal damage on a property owner. He walked back inside his quiet house, picked up his smartphone, and dialed the direct personal line of the chief city zoning and code enforcement inspector, a man he played golf with every Sunday. He reported a highly illegal and dangerous commercial nightclub operation running in a strictly residential zone. As Terrence and Chelsea cowered under their expensive blankets, hoping the terrible nightmare would just end by morning, they had absolutely no idea that a massive government hammer was already swinging straight toward their front door. The aggressive pounding on the front door started at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. It was not a polite neighborly knock. It was the heavy, authoritative strike of someone demanding immediate entry. Terrence dragged himself out of his expensive bed, his eyes completely bloodshot from a miserable, sleepless night. Chelsea pulled the heavy silk comforter over her head, refusing to deal with whatever new disaster was waiting outside. Terrence stumbled down the main staircase, tying his silk robe tightly around his waist. He unlocked the heavy front door and pulled it open. Standing on his front porch was a tall, stern-looking man wearing a crisp municipal uniform and a highly polished silver badge clipped to his belt. Before Terrence could even ask a single question, the man held up his official city identification card right in front of Terrence's face. He introduced himself as the senior zoning and code enforcement inspector for the city planning department. He stated clearly that his office had received multiple severe complaints overnight regarding an illegal commercial nightclub and unpermitted short-term lodging facility operating out of this specific residential address. Terrence immediately tried to block the doorway with his body. He forced a fake, arrogant smile onto his face and tried to use his best corporate negotiation voice. He assured the inspector that there had been a simple misunderstanding. He claimed they merely had a few loud friends over for a private gathering and that the noise got slightly out of hand. The inspector did not smile back. He looked past Terrence's shoulder, staring directly down the hallway toward the basement door. The strong, unmistakable stench of stale beer, cheap perfume, and illegal narcotics was still lingering heavily in the morning air. The inspector informed Terrence that he did not need an invitation to investigate an active threat to public health and safety. He forcefully pushed his way past Terrence and walked straight toward the basement stairwell. Terrence followed him in an absolute panic, his bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. When the inspector reached the bottom of the stairs, he pulled out a digital camera and began snapping photographs of the absolute disaster zone. The concrete floor was covered in sticky spilled alcohol and shattered glass. The cheap air mattress Chelsea had dragged down there was stained and completely deflated. The walls I had perfectly framed were deeply scratched, and cigarette burns ruined the wooden trim. The inspector pulled a thick citation pad from his leather duty belt and clicked his pen. He began listing the massive violations out loud. Operating an unlicensed commercial hotel, violating strict residential zoning ordinances, creating a severe public nuisance, failing to meet commercial fire safety codes. Terrence begged him to stop writing. He pleaded for a simple warning, promising he would delete the online listing immediately and never do it again. The inspector ignored his pathetic whining. He ripped the top copy off the citation pad and slapped it hard against Terrence's chest. It was a massive municipal fine for exactly $5,000 payable immediately to the city clerk office. The inspector looked Terrence dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. He gave Terrence exactly 48 hours to pay the fine in full. If the money was not received by the deadline, the city would issue an immediate warrant for his arrest and place a highly destructive tax lien on the property. The inspector turned around, walked up the stairs, and left the house without saying another word. Terrence stood in the ruined basement, clutching the yellow citation paper in his trembling hands. $5,000. He did not even have $50 in his primary checking account. His secret bank loan was already bleeding him dry. If he asked Chelsea for the money, she would undoubtedly divorce him on the spot for letting the inspector inside the house. He was completely trapped in a corner of his own making. Desperation makes a desperate man do incredibly foolish things. Terrence crept quietly back up the stairs and tiptoed into the master bedroom. Chelsea was still fast asleep, completely unaware of the financial death sentence her husband was holding. Terrence walked over to her expensive designer purse resting on the vanity table. He carefully unzipped the side pocket and pulled out the spare electronic key fob to her luxury imported SUV. Then he went into his own personal filing cabinet and pulled out the physical paper title to her vehicle. He knew exactly what he was doing was highly illegal, but the sheer terror of going to county jail for unpaid city fines overrode any remaining common sense. He quietly dressed in yesterday clothes, sneaked out the front door, and climbed into Chelsea's pristine vehicle. He drove straight to a highly predatory title pawn shop located in a rundown commercial district across town. The shop was a dirty neon-lit building surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The manager behind the bulletproof glass took one look at the desperate, sweating man in the luxury car and knew exactly how to exploit him. Terrence signed away the title to his wife's vehicle in exchange for a short-term cash loan of $5,000. The interest rate attached to the loan was absolutely astronomical, legally bordering on extortion, but Terrence did not care. He just needed the cash to keep himself out of handcuffs today. He took the thick envelope of money, drove straight to the city municipal building, and paid the code enforcement fine in full. He felt a brief, pathetic rush of relief as the clerk handed him a stamped receipt. He thought he had successfully outsmarted the system. He thought he had bought himself enough time to figure out a permanent solution. He drove the luxury SUV back to his quiet suburban neighborhood and parked it perfectly in the driveway, hoping Chelsea would never notice the missing title. As he walked up the paved path to his front door, he stopped to check the physical metal mailbox. Inside, resting on top of the junk mail, was a thick envelope made of premium heavy parchment paper. It was marked with a bright red certified mail stamp requiring a signature upon receipt. Terrence signed the mail carrier slip and tore the envelope open right there on the front porch. The letterhead belonged to the highly prestigious corporate law firm of Mitchell and Partners. Terrence scanned the legal document, his eyes widening in pure absolute horror. It was a formal notice of default. The letter explicitly stated that the property owner had violated the strict terms of a hidden $300,000 deed of trust by operating an illegal commercial business and damaging the property value. It demanded payment in full within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Terrence dropped the paper onto the porch. He had just pawned his wife's car to survive a $5,000 fine, completely unaware that my $300,000 legal guillotine had just dropped straight toward his neck. Terrence stood completely frozen on his front porch. The heavy parchment envelope in his hands felt like it was radiating heat. He stared at the bold red certified mail stamp and the embossed logo of Mitchell and Partners Financial Company in the top left corner. He had never heard of this firm in his entire life. His heart pounded wildly in his chest as he tore the thick paper open with his thumb. He pulled out a stack of dense legal documents fastened together with a heavy brass staple. The very first page was a formal notice of default and immediate acceleration of debt. Terrence scanned the document, his eyes darting frantically across the complicated legal jargon. The words blurred together until his vision finally locked onto a single terrifying number printed clearly in bold black ink near the bottom of the page: $300,000. He blinked hard, thinking his exhausted brain was playing a cruel trick on him. He read the number out loud to the empty suburban street: $300,000. He leaned heavily against the brick pillar of his porch, suddenly feeling extremely lightheaded. The $5,000 municipal fine he just paid by pawning his wife's vehicle was absolutely nothing compared to the massive financial bomb he was currently holding. He rushed inside the house and slammed the front door shut, locking it quickly as if the lawyers were actively chasing him down the street. He sprinted into the kitchen and spread the thick stack of papers across the granite island. He read through the terms with mounting horror. The document clearly outlined a hidden deed of trust that had been legally attached to the property transfer 3 years ago. When I handed Terrence the deed to the house, I secretly maintained a massive financial lien on the property as a security measure. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. The contract explicitly stated that the $300,000 lien would remain dormant and require absolutely no monthly payments, as long as the primary residence was properly maintained and used strictly as a single-family home. However, the contract contained a very specific acceleration clause. If the property owner engaged in any illegal commercial activity caused significant damage to the structure or violated local zoning ordinances, the entire $300,000 balance would become due immediately. Terrence read the attached appendix and felt the blood drain completely from his face. The law firm had already obtained a certified copy of the municipal citation he received just hours ago. They possessed time-stamped photographs of the illegal online rental listing Chelsea had recklessly created. They had irrefutable proof of the severe structural damage caused by the underground drug party, the noise complaints, and the police dispatch logs. By turning my quiet basement into a chaotic short-term rental to illegally extract a quick buck, Terrence and Chelsea had directly violated the core terms of the trust deed. They had actively and severely diminished the physical and legal value of the property. The letter stated in cold and uncompromising legal terms that the full $300,000 had to be deposited into the law firm trust account within 30 days. If the funds were not received, Mitchell and partners would immediately initiate full foreclosure proceedings, seize the property, and legally evict Terrence and Chelsea onto the street. Terrence grabbed his hair and pulled hard. He was suffocating. He had absolutely no idea this financial trap even existed. He thought I was just a naive old man who blindly handed over $1 million asset without a single string attached. He completely underestimated the cold, calculated foresight of a man who spent his entire life writing ironclad construction contracts. He paced the kitchen floor, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. He was broke. His wife's car was pawned, and now he owed $300,000 to a faceless corporate entity that was actively hunting him. Panic quickly morphed into blind, irrational rage. Terrence grabbed his smartphone from the kitchen counter and violently punched in the phone number listed at the top of the legal letterhead. He did not consult a lawyer. He did not take time to calm down and think clearly. He acted purely on defensive instinct. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, calm voice answered the line. It was Robert Mitchell himself. Terrence did not even let the man introduce himself. He launched into a completely unhinged, screaming tirade. He yelled into the phone, his voice echoing off the kitchen walls. He called the law firm a scam operation. He accused them of forging legal documents and attempting to illegally extort a hardworking family. He screamed that he was a highly respected corporate executive and that he was going to hire the most ruthless legal team in the entire state to sue them into absolute bankruptcy. He threatened to destroy Robert Mitchell's career and drag his firm through the mud. On the other end of the line, Robert Mitchell sat comfortably in his plush leather office chair overlooking the Atlanta skyline. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice to match Terrence's frantic screaming. He simply pressed a small, blinking red button on his sophisticated office phone system. A soft, automated beep echoed on the line, indicating that the call was now being legally recorded. Robert waited patiently for Terrence to run out of breath. When Terrence finally stopped to gasp for air, Robert spoke in a terrifyingly calm and measured tone. He informed Terrence that under state law, threatening a licensed attorney and attempting to intimidate an officer of the court during an active collection proceeding was a severe legal offense. He calmly stated that the audio recording of this highly aggressive phone call was currently being downloaded and automatically attached to the formal foreclosure file as evidence of hostile non-compliance. Robert advised Terrence to pack his belongings quickly, wished him a pleasant afternoon, and hung up the phone. Terrence stood in his kitchen listening to the dial tone, finally realizing he had just handed his executioner the exact rope needed to hang him. Terrence slammed his phone down on the granite kitchen island so hard the digital screen cracked straight down the middle. The recording of his own voice threatening a powerful corporate lawyer echoed loudly in his mind. He was completely out of options, running entirely on pure adrenaline and blind defensive rage. He needed someone to blame for his catastrophic failures, and his frantic mind immediately snapped right back to me. For the past 2 years, I had spent at least 3 evenings a week at a highly exclusive downtown steakhouse. Terrence and Chelsea had always arrogantly assumed I was working in the back kitchen of that establishment. They firmly believed I was spending my nights scrubbing greasy iron pots, washing dishes, and mopping the dining room floors just to earn a few extra miserable dollars for my personal groceries. He stormed out of his house, leaving the foreclosure notice sitting on the counter. He climbed into the heavily mortgaged luxury sedan he had somehow managed to keep from the repo man and drove recklessly toward the city center. He gripped the leather steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He fully planned to march right through the swinging kitchen doors of that restaurant, grab the dirty mop out of my calloused hands, and publicly humiliate me. He wanted to drag me out of the utility closet and scream at me until I agreed to call off the law firm and forgive the $300,000 debt. He violently threw his car keys at the confused valet parking attendant outside the steakhouse and forcefully shoved his way through the heavy brass and glass front doors. The highly polished restaurant manager immediately stepped forward to block Terrence, taking quick note of his severely disheveled clothes, sweating forehead, and completely wild eyes. Terrence roughly pushed the man aside without saying a single word. He marched furiously across the plush carpet, heading straight toward the back hallway where the kitchen staff operated. But halfway across the dimly lit and elegant dining room, he completely froze in his tracks. His entire body went rigidly stiff. Was his father. I was not wearing a faded was his father. I was not wearing a faded flannel work shirt. I was not wearing steel toe boots. I was not holding a dirty mop or carrying a plastic bucket of soapy water. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit made from imported Italian wool. A crisp white shirt and a silk pocket square rested perfectly against my chest. I was sitting at a massive round table filled with premium dry-aged steaks, expensive chilled seafood towers, and crystal glasses filled with vintage wine. 2 of the most powerful and wealthiest commercial real estate developers in the state of Georgia were sitting directly across from me, leaning in and hanging on to every single word I said. I was laughing warmly, raising my crystal glass to toast a highly lucrative new commercial zoning contract our partnership had just successfully closed. Terrence stood in the middle of the dining room and stared at me with his mouth hanging wide open. The majestic image completely and violently shattered his pathetic reality. The allegedly broke old man he had mercilessly charged $1,500 a month to live in a dark, damp basement was currently hosting a private dinner that cost significantly more than Terrence earned in an entire month. The initial shock quickly boiled over into a toxic, blinding jealousy. Terrence completely lost his mind. He stormed right up to our exclusive table, his face flushed bright red with pure, unhinged anger. He slammed his sweaty hands flat on the pristine white linen tablecloth, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently and spill dark red wine onto the table. The 2 wealthy developers stopped talking immediately and stared at him in absolute shock. Terrence completely ignored them and directed his frantic rage directly at me. He screamed at the top of his lungs that I was a deceitful, lying fraud. He yelled that I had spent years maliciously pretending to be a pathetic, broke old man just to make him look like a terrible son. He demanded to know exactly where I got the money for the tailored suit and the expensive dinner while he was currently drowning in secret bank debt. He shrieked wildly about the $300,000 trust deed, actively accusing me of plotting a criminal conspiracy to ruin his life and steal his home. He called me a greedy, selfish old man who was illegally hiding vast family wealth from his own flesh and blood. The entire restaurant went dead silent. Dozens of wealthy patrons stopped eating their expensive meals and turned in their chairs to watch the pathetic spectacle. I did not flinch. I did not stand up to defend my honor. I simply took a slow, calm sip of my sparkling water, placed the glass gently back down on the table, and looked up at him as if he were a completely insane stranger who had just wandered in from the street. I turned my head slightly toward the highly panicked restaurant manager who was already rushing over with a look of sheer terror on his face. I did not raise my voice or show even a single ounce of embarrassment. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers exactly 1 time. It was a sharp, commanding sound that cut right through the pathetic screaming of my son. I calmly told the restaurant manager that this erratic individual was aggressively harassing my business clients and requested that he be removed from the premises immediately. Within seconds, 2 massive security guards wearing dark suits descended upon Terrence from behind. They grabbed him firmly by both of his arms, locking his elbows in place. Terrence thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and screaming my name over and over again, demanding that I answer his questions. The security guards did not show any mercy or hesitation. They lifted him entirely off his feet and dragged him backward right through the center of the elegant dining room. He looked exactly like a rabid stray dog being hauled away by animal control. I watched him disappear through the front doors. Then I turned back to my highly respected business partners, offered a brief and polite apology for the unfortunate interruption, and calmly signaled our waiter to bring us another fresh round of drinks. Terrence was forcefully thrown out the front doors of the restaurant. He landed hard on the cold concrete sidewalk, severely scraping the palms of his hands and tearing the knee of his expensive dress pants. He sat there in the street dirt, breathing heavily, watching the valet driver slowly bring his heavily financed car up to the curb. His mind was racing a mile a minute. The public humiliation burned deep in his chest, but a dark, sinister realization quickly overpowered his shame. If I had the personal power and wealth to host dinners like that, and if I owned a massive financial company capable of issuing $300,000 liens without blinking, then there had to be millions of dollars hidden away somewhere. Blind envy completely erased his fear of the impending foreclosure. He pulled himself up from the dirty sidewalk and reached into his leather wallet. He bypassed his maxed-out debit cards and pulled out his very last high-limit emergency credit card. He leaned heavily against the brick wall of the restaurant and searched his smartphone for the most ruthless, aggressive private investigator agency in the city of Atlanta. He dialed the number, his hands shaking with malicious intent. He was going to find out exactly how much money the old man was hiding, and he was fully determined to find a legal loophole to take every single penny of it for himself. The heavy manila envelope hit the glass surface of Terrence's dining table with a loud and incredibly satisfying thud. The private investigator Terrence had recklessly hired was a large, intimidating man wearing a cheap suit and smelling strongly of stale coffee. He did not bother sitting down. He simply tapped his thick finger against the top of the sealed folder and demanded the final payment for his services. He explicitly stated that he had to pull significant strings and bribe 2 different corporate contacts to get past the heavy security firewalls protecting my financial information. Terrence's hands were visibly shaking as he pulled out his very last emergency credit card. The investigator ran the card through a portable mobile reader attached to his phone, waited for the loud beep confirming the transaction was approved, and walked out the front door without saying another word. Terrence stood alone in his quiet kitchen, staring at the thick brown envelope. He grabbed a kitchen knife, sliced the top open, and dumped the massive stack of confidential documents onto the table. Terrence leaned over the paperwork and began reading through the first page. It was a comprehensive breakdown of corporate ownership records filed with the state. He saw my full legal name printed clearly at the very top. Right below it was my official title: Senior Managing Partner and Majority Shareholder of Hayes and Sterling Commercial Development. His eyes scanned further down the page to the estimated asset valuation column. He read the numbers out loud, his voice cracking violently. $35 million in commercial real estate holdings. Another $12 million in liquid investment portfolios. The supposedly poor old man he had charged $1,500 a month for a damp basement was currently sitting on a net worth approaching $50 million. Terrence collapsed into a dining chair, completely unable to process the massive figures staring back at him. He had spent his entire adult life desperately leasing luxury cars and maxing out high-interest credit cards just to pretend he was rich. Meanwhile, the father he deeply despised for being a simple blue-collar worker actually owned half the corporate buildings in their city skyline. Chelsea walked into the kitchen wearing a silk bathrobe, her face pale and exhausted from the ongoing stress of their impending foreclosure. She saw Terrence sitting paralyzed at the table and walked over to see what he was looking at. Terrence silently pushed the financial summary sheet toward her. Chelsea picked up the paper and her eyes immediately locked onto the massive string of zeros. For exactly 10 seconds, the kitchen was absolutely dead silent. Then Chelsea completely lost her mind. The initial shock instantly transformed into an aggressive and highly toxic greed. Her face flushed bright red and she slammed her hands down on the glass table. She did not feel any shame for kicking me out of the house. Instead, she felt violently betrayed and robbed. She started screaming that I had intentionally manipulated them and subjected them to deep emotional and financial distress by hiding family wealth. She paced the kitchen floor rapidly, formulating an incredibly delusional narrative in her head. She convinced herself that because Terrence was my only biological son, half of that $50 million empire legally and rightfully belonged to them right now. She turned to Terrence and told him they were going to sue me for everything I had. She claimed I had a strict legal and moral obligation to provide for my dependents and that my refusal to pay off their secret debts constituted financial abandonment. Terrence, still completely paralyzed by fear from the $300,000 foreclosure notice, weakly argued that they could not afford to hire a lawyer to fight a billionaire corporate firm. Chelsea looked at him with absolute disgust. She told him he was a spineless coward and that she did not need to pay a lawyer to get what she deserved. She believed the sheer threat of a massive public scandal would force me to quietly settle out of court to protect my corporate reputation. She stormed into the home office, booted up her laptop, and began furiously typing a formal legal demand letter. She spent 2 hours drafting an incredibly arrogant and threatening document. She demanded full forgiveness of the $300,000 lien, immediate transfer of the property title back into their names with no conditions, and an additional cash payment of $2 million for extreme emotional distress. If these demands were not met within 48 hours, she threatened to file a massive public lawsuit and drag my name through the local media. She printed the document on heavy cardstock, signed her name with a vicious flourish, and shoved it into her expensive leather designer purse. She completely ignored Terrence pleading with her to wait and think things through. She grabbed her car keys, marched out the front door, and drove straight toward the downtown financial district. Chelsea pulled her vehicle up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Mitchell & Partners. She aggressively tossed her keys to the valet and marched through the revolving doors with her head held high. She strutted past the security desk with a deeply arrogant smirk firmly planted on her face, fully believing she held the ultimate winning hand. She thought her printed piece of paper was a brilliant masterstroke of intimidation that would immediately force a $50 million empire to its knees. She stepped onto the executive elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the silver doors smoothly slid shut, she adjusted her blouse and smiled at her own reflection in the polished metal. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived intelligence and power. She had absolutely no idea that the legal demand letter sitting inside her purse was the exact trigger mechanism needed to permanently destroy her life. She thought she was walking into a negotiation room to collect millions of dollars. She did not realize she was marching completely blindfolded straight into a legal guillotine. Chelsea pushed past the heavy oak doors of Robert Mitchell Corner office without waiting for his secretary to announce her. She marched directly to his massive mahogany desk and aggressively slammed her printed demand letter right in the center of his pristine leather blotter. Robert slowly looked up from his computer monitor, his expression completely unreadable. Chelsea did not give him a chance to speak. She leaned forward, placing both of her hands firmly on his desk, and delivered her ultimatum with absolute arrogance. She proudly declared that she knew exactly who Calvin Hayes really was, and exactly how much money he was hiding in his corporate bank accounts. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the document and loudly listed her non-negotiable terms. She demanded the immediate cancellation of the $300,000 foreclosure notice. She demanded the property deed be signed completely over to her and Terrence without any hidden conditions. And finally, she demanded a cash settlement of exactly $2 million for severe emotional distress and financial manipulation. She boldly threatened that if the money was not wired into her bank account within 48 hours, she would immediately file a massive public lawsuit and drag my corporate empire through every local television news station in Atlanta. She crossed her arms tightly, smiled smugly, and waited for the high-powered lawyer to panic and beg for mercy. Robert Mitchell did not beg. He did not panic. He did not even blink. He calmly picked up her heavy cardstock letter, adjusted his reading glasses, and scanned her aggressive demands. A deep, resonant chuckle escaped his chest. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the genuine amusement of a predator watching a blind mouse intentionally walk straight into a baited metal trap. He gently set her letter aside as if it were a silly child drawing. Then he unlocked his top desk drawer and pulled out a single, neatly bound legal folder. He opened it and slowly rotated it so the text faced Chelsea. It was a certified copy of the original property transfer agreement I had given to Terrence 3 years ago. Robert tapped his expensive gold pen against a specific paragraph located near the very bottom of the third page. He instructed Chelsea to read Section 7 aloud. Chelsea scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she leaned over the mahogany desk. She thought it was just standard meaningless legal jargon designed to scare amateurs. but as her eyes scanned the bold black text, the healthy color rapidly drained from her arrogant face. Section 7 was explicitly titled the Hostile Action Clause. It clearly stated that the transfer of the property was a conditional gift strictly dependent on maintaining peaceful family relations. The clause dictated that if Terrence Hayes or any legal spouse acting directly on his behalf ever initiated any hostile legal action, filed a lawsuit, or presented a formal financial extortion demand against Calvin Hayes, the deed of transfer would be automatically and immediately rendered null and void. The legal ownership of the property would instantly revert back to my holding company without the need for a protracted court battle or a judge ruling. Chelsea started shaking her head frantically. She stepped back from the desk, her voice rising in sheer panic. She stammered that the contract had to be illegal. She yelled that I could not just take back $1 million house over a simple piece of paper. Robert folded his hands together and looked at her with ice-cold professionalism. He explained that I was not just taking it back. He explained that she had literally just handed the house back to me on a silver platter. He told her that in the state of Georgia, conditional gift deeds were highly enforceable, especially when drafted by a corporate law firm that specialized in bulletproof real estate contracts. He calmly pointed out that by storming into his office and serving him with a documented, physically signed extortion demand for $2 million, she had just legally executed the exact trigger condition outlined in Section 7. Chelsea gasped sharply, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sickening realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her brilliant masterstroke of intimidation was actually a legal suicide note. She had thought she was outsmarting an exhausted old man and his lawyer. Instead, she had just walked right into a meticulously laid trap I had patiently set 3 years ago, knowing exactly how greedy and ruthless she would eventually become. Robert Mitchell slowly pulled back the cuff of his tailored suit jacket and looked down at his expensive gold watch. He noted the time out loud. It was exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. He looked back up at Chelsea, his eyes completely devoid of sympathy. He officially informed her that as of 2:15, Terrence Hayes was completely stripped of his property rights. The house no longer belonged to them in any legal capacity. He told her that the $300,000 foreclosure notice was now completely irrelevant because you cannot foreclose on a house you already legally own. Robert reached across his desk, picked up her printed demand letter, and dropped it straight into his heavy-duty paper shredder. The loud grinding noise filled the silent office as her $2 million fantasy was chewed into tiny pieces of useless trash. He told Chelsea they had exactly 7 days to vacate my property before the county sheriff arrived to forcibly remove them for criminal trespassing. Chelsea stumbled backward, completely unable to breathe. She turned and ran out of the corporate office, sprinting blindly down the hallway toward the elevators. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She burst out of the glass building, fumbled for her smartphone with trembling fingers, and dialed Terrence's number. When he answered, she was sobbing uncontrollably right there on the busy downtown sidewalk. She frantically confessed exactly what she had done in the lawyer office. She told him her brilliant lawsuit idea completely backfired, and that the house was officially gone forever. Terrence screamed through the phone speaker, his voice cracking with pure terror and absolute desperation. They were completely out of time, entirely out of money, and about to be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. In a state of absolute unhinged panic, Terrence proposed a highly illegal and incredibly reckless plan. He told Chelsea they needed to beat the law firm to the public county registry. He instructed her to rush home immediately so they could list the house on the market at a massive discount, find a desperate cash buyer, and illegally sell the property before the ownership reversal officially hit the government computer systems. They decided to commit massive real estate fraud, take the stolen cash, and run away. Terrence sat at the edge of his heavy glass dining table watching the wealthy real estate investor carefully read over the expedited purchase agreement. It had taken Terrence exactly 48 hours of frantic phone calls to find a desperate cash buyer willing to overlook the lack of standard inspections in exchange for a massive discount on the overall property value. The investor was a sharp older man wearing a tailored gray suit who specialized in flipping distressed suburban homes. He held a thick gold pen hovering right above the signature line. A certified cashier check for a $50,000 non-refundable deposit was sitting right in the middle of the table. Terrence could literally feel his heart pounding violently against his ribs. That single piece of paper was his ultimate escape ticket. If the investor signed the contract and handed over the check, Terrence and Chelsea could deposit the money, pack their suitcases, and completely disappear from the state before the county registry officially processed the ownership reversal my lawyer had initiated. Chelsea stood nervously in the corner of the dining room, twisting her expensive diamond ring around her finger. She offered the investor a tight, fake smile as he finally nodded in satisfaction and lowered the tip of his gold pen toward the paper. Before the dark ink could even touch the white paper, the heavy front door of the house swung open. The independent title agent Terrence had hired at a premium rush fee to facilitate the illegal closing walked rapidly into the dining room. He did not look happy. He was holding his open laptop in one hand and his cell phone in the other. He loudly instructed the investor to drop the pen immediately and step away from the table. Terrence jumped out of his chair, his voice cracking as he angrily demanded to know what the title agent was doing, interrupting a private and highly sensitive financial transaction. The agent ignored Terrence completely and turned his laptop screen toward the wealthy investor. He explained that his firm always runs one final automated background check on the county registry database, exactly 60 seconds before officially authorizing any massive cash transfer. He pointed a stern finger at the glowing screen. The official county records had just updated a few hours ago. The property no longer legally belonged to Terrence Hayes. The title agent explained in a cold, clinical voice that a corporate law firm had successfully triggered a hostile action clause, effectively reverting the property deed back to the original holding company. Furthermore, the property was now permanently locked down by a massive $300,000 judicial lien filed directly by Mitchell and Partners. The title agent looked at Terrence with absolute disgust. He stated clearly that attempting to sell a property he did not legally own while intentionally hiding a massive financial lien was a severe federal crime known as wire fraud. Terrence felt the room start to spin. He desperately tried to form a coherent sentence, but his mouth was completely dry. He knew Robert Mitchell was fast, but he never expected the corporate lawyer to force the paperwork through the county clerk office in less than 2 days. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely crushed him. The wealthy investor dropped his gold pen on the glass table as if the metal were burning hot. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He snatched his $50,000 cashier check off the table and shoved it aggressively into his suit jacket pocket. He leaned heavily across the table, getting right into Terrence's face. He called Terrence a pathetic, desperate scam artist who belonged in a federal penitentiary. He shouted that he had been in the real estate business for 30 years and had never seen such a blatant, stupid attempt at criminal fraud. He warned Terrence that he was going to personally contact his own ruthless legal team to ensure Terrence was permanently blacklisted from every single financial institution and real estate brokerage in the state of Georgia. Chelsea tried to step forward and offer a pathetic, trembling excuse, claiming there was just a minor clerical error at the county office that they could easily fix by tomorrow. The investor turned his wrath toward her. He barked at her to shut her mouth, calling them both a pair of cheap criminal frauds who were trying to steal his hard-earned money. He grabbed his leather briefcase, stormed out of the dining room, and slammed the heavy front door so hard the glass windows rattled violently in their wooden frames. The title agent simply packed up his laptop, shook his head in complete disbelief, and followed the investor out the door. Terrence's legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into his dining chair, his arms falling limply to his sides. The brilliant, highly illegal escape plan he had banked his entire future on had just violently exploded right in his face. He stared blankly at the unsigned purchase agreement sitting on the glass table. There was no more secret bank loan to draw from. There was no $50,000 escape fund. His wife's luxury car was pawned to a predatory loan shark. His primary checking account was severely overdrawn, and his credit cards were entirely maxed out. He was completely stripped of every single financial resource he had ever possessed. He buried his face in his trembling hands and let out a long, hollow sob. He was a corporate manager who used to mock his father for wearing cheap work boots, and now he did not even have enough liquid cash to buy a cheap hotel room for the night. The absolute financial ruin he had been frantically running from had finally caught up to him, pinning him firmly to the ground with zero possibility of escape. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. Chelsea stood frozen against the dining room wall, her face completely pale and devoid of all her usual arrogant pride. She slowly slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold hardwood floor, staring at Terrence with eyes full of terrifying realization. They were completely trapped in a house they no longer owned, waiting for the inevitable hammer to fall. Just as the crushing weight of their absolute poverty settled into the quiet room, a harsh, piercing sound shattered the suburban silence. The distinct wail of police sirens echoed loudly down the street. The sound grew rapidly louder, approaching their exact location with terrifying speed. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights suddenly reflected through the large front windows, casting long, frantic shadows across the dining room walls. The heavy tires of multiple law enforcement vehicles screeched to a violent halt right in their front driveway. The failed real estate transaction was not the end of their problems. The true nightmare of their evening was just pulling up to the front door, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the large dining room windows did not belong to a tactical police unit coming to arrest Terrence for real estate fraud. As Terrence and Chelsea stumbled out the heavy front door into the cool night air, they saw a single county police cruiser parked parallel at the very edge of their driveway. Right behind the official police vehicle was a massive, heavily rusted commercial flatbed tow truck with its loud diesel engine roaring aggressively in the quiet suburban neighborhood. A large man wearing a bright yellow, high-visibility reflective vest was already kneeling in the driveway, rapidly attaching heavy steel chains and thick towing hooks to the front axle of Chelsea's pristine luxury imported vehicle. Chelsea let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed down the entire street. She sprinted barefoot across the manicured front lawn, frantically waving her arms and ordering the dirty mechanic to step away from her expensive property immediately. She screamed at the police officer who was casually leaning against his patrol cruiser, demanding that he immediately draw his weapon and arrest the tow truck driver for grand theft auto. The police officer did not unholster his weapon. He did not even flinch. He simply pulled a folded piece of bright yellow paper from his dark uniform shirt pocket and walked calmly up the paved driveway. He handed the official document directly to Chelsea, explaining in a bored, highly practiced, monotone voice that he was only there to provide a standard civil standby. He told her the vehicle repossession was entirely legal, thoroughly documented, and fully authorized by the primary title holder. Chelsea snatched the yellow paper from the hands of the officer. She held it up to the flashing police lights, squinting to read the small black text. It was a formal vehicle repossession order issued directly from a highly predatory title pawn shop located in the worst commercial district across town. Printed clearly at the very bottom of the page, right next to the secured loan amount of exactly $5,000, was her husband's legally binding signature. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers. She slowly lowered the paper and turned to face Terrence, who was cowering near the front porch pillars like a frightened child caught stealing candy. The absolute truth of their severe financial bankruptcy finally shattered every single one of Chelsea's grand delusions. She realized in that exact horrifying moment that Terrence had secretly stolen her physical car title from her personal filing cabinet and pawned her vehicle just to temporarily pay off a city code violation caused by the disastrous underground party. He had completely sold out her primary mode of transportation and her most prized social status symbol for a few miserable $1,000, all behind her back. The rage that violently erupted from Chelsea was volcanic. She marched right up to Terrence and slapped him directly across the face with all the physical strength she could possibly muster. The sharp, violent cracking sound of her palm hitting his cheek echoed loudly through the quiet neighborhood, drawing the immediate attention of several wealthy neighbors who were now standing on their porches watching the entire humiliating spectacle. Chelsea did not care who was watching. She did not care about preserving her fake high-class reputation anymore. She screamed right into Terrence, face, her voice dripping with absolute venom and pure hatred. She called him a pathetic, useless failure who had completely destroyed her youth and ruined her life. She yelled that he was a fraudulent clown playing dress-up in expensive suits he could not afford. She screamed that he was not even half the man his father was, and that she should never have married a weak, spineless coward who could not even manage to keep a roof over his own head. Terrence held his stinging red cheek, completely paralyzed by shame and fear. He was entirely unable to utter a single word in his own defense. He just stood there and took the vicious public verbal beating while the heavy tow truck engaged its hydraulic flatbed winch. The incredibly loud grinding noise of the pulling metal gears drowned out Terrence's pathetic whispered apologies as Chelsea's beautiful luxury vehicle was unceremoniously dragged up the steep metal ramp and hauled away into the dark night. Chelsea did not shed a single tear as she watched her car disappear down the street. She spun around on her bare heels, marched back inside the house, and stomped heavily up the wooden stairs toward the master bedroom. Terrence followed closely behind her like a beaten dog, begging and pleading with her to calm down, promising her that he would figure out a way to fix everything by tomorrow morning. Chelsea completely ignored his pathetic whining. She dragged 2 massive designer suitcases from the walk-in closet and began blindly throwing her expensive silk dresses, designer shoes, and luxury leather handbags into them. She did not bother folding a single item. She was packing with the frantic, desperate energy of a survivor abandoning a rapidly sinking ship. She aggressively zipped the heavy suitcases shut, grabbed their extendable handles, and dragged them down the main staircase, the heavy plastic wheels bumping loudly and violently against every single wooden step. When she finally reached the front foyer, she stopped and turned to face Terrence one last time. She reached for her left hand and forcefully pulled her heavy, expensive diamond wedding ring off her finger. She looked him dead in the eye, told him she was contacting a ruthless divorce attorney the very next morning, and threw the heavy diamond ring directly at his chest with incredible force. The sharp metal bounced off his designer dress shirt and rolled away into a dark, dusty corner of the hallway floor. Chelsea pulled out her smartphone, ordered an expensive premium rideshare vehicle to take her directly back to her parents' house, and walked out the front door into the night without ever looking back. Terrence stood completely alone in the massive, echoing foyer of the house he no longer legally owned. His wife had just abandoned him, his car was gone, his bank accounts were entirely frozen, and he was facing imminent law enforcement eviction. He slowly walked into the dark living room and collapsed heavily onto the expensive Italian leather sofa. He closed his exhausted eyes, desperately hoping to simply wake up from this catastrophic nightmare. But the universe was absolutely not finished punishing him just yet. Exactly 10 minutes after Chelsea drove away, the bright overhead lights in the living room suddenly flickered twice and died completely. The low, constant, comforting hum of the kitchen refrigerator instantly stopped. The glowing digital clocks on the microwave and the kitchen oven went entirely black. The massive central air conditioning unit ground to a heavy halt, leaving the entire house trapped in a suffocating dead silence. Terrence sat up in the pitch-black room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The utility power company had just remotely disconnected the main electricity grid to the property. He had been so entirely consumed by his secret bank loans, the disastrous short-term rental fines, and the massive $300,000 legal lien that he had completely ignored paying the standard utility bills for 3 consecutive months. Terrence was now completely broke, utterly alone, and sitting in absolute darkness. He pulled his knees up to his chest in the pitch-black room, finally realizing that the arrogant empire he had tried to build on the back of his father had completely crumbled into dust. Tomorrow morning he would have to do the one thing he swore he would never do again. He would have to go crawling back to the man he had thrown into the basement. The morning sun was brutally bright, and the humidity was already suffocating as Terrence stepped off a cheap public transit bus on the very outskirts of the affluent northern suburbs. He had spent his last few dollars on the bus fare, forcing himself to walk over 2 miles along the winding, heavily wooded roads just to reach the address printed in the private investigator file. His expensive designer dress shoes, the same ones he used to loudly tap against the hardwood floors to assert his dominance, were now completely ruined by the roadside dirt. His tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and smelled of nervous sweat from sleeping on the living room sofa in a house with absolutely no air conditioning. When he finally reached the towering wrought iron gates of my $2 million lakefront villa, he did not press the silver intercom button. His mind was far too frantic for any kind of basic logic or polite etiquette. Driven by pure blinding desperation and toxic entitlement, he grabbed the heavy metal bars and recklessly hauled his exhausted body over the tall security fence. He tore the fabric of his expensive trousers and severely scraped the palms of his hands on the rough stone pillar, before dropping heavily onto the pristine manicured lawn inside the private compound. He immediately scrambled to his feet and began sprinting blindly toward the massive glass front doors of my home, completely ignoring the high-tech security cameras that were silently tracking his every single frantic movement. Terrence did not even make it halfway across the expansive green lawn before 2 massive private security contractors materialized from behind a row of decorative hedges. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute military precision. Before Terrence could even shout my name, the guards tackled him hard into the freshly watered grass, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. Terrence thrashed and kicked wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that the guards release him immediately because he was the biological son of the wealthy homeowner. I heard the pathetic commotion all the way from my master bedroom. I calmly poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, walked out onto my expansive second-floor wooden balcony, and looked down at the pathetic scene unfolding in my front yard. I rested my calloused hands on the cool glass railing and stared down at the son who had tried to extort $1,500 from me just a few weeks ago. Terrence saw me standing up there in my comfortable morning robe and immediately stopped fighting the heavy hands of the guards. But instead of breaking down crying and begging for my forgiveness like a normal person who had hit rock bottom, his deeply ingrained arrogance took complete control of his brain. He looked up at me with a face entirely twisted by anger, jealousy, and extreme entitlement. He screamed that I was legally and morally obligated to call off the corporate lawyers and cancel the $300,000 foreclosure immediately. He yelled that Chelsea had abandoned him, his luxury car had been repossessed in the middle of the night, and he was currently sitting in the dark without electricity. And somehow he blamed all of his massive failures entirely on me. He shrieked that a real father would never allow his own flesh and blood to be thrown out onto the street to suffer. He demanded that I wire $50,000 into his bank account right now to fix his destroyed credit and help him win his greedy wife back. He actually had the absolute audacity to quote a twisted, entirely fabricated version of family law, claiming that I owed him lifetime financial protection simply because he was my direct heir. He did not offer a single word of apology for locking me in a damp basement. He did not express even a fraction of an ounce of remorse for treating me like a stray dog or allowing his wife to humiliate me. He was entirely consumed by the severe delusion that my $50 million corporate empire was his personal piggy bank, and he was furious that I had finally changed the locks on the vault. I stood on the balcony and listened to his entire unhinged rant without interrupting him once. I let him scream until his throat was completely raw and his voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, savoring the rich flavor, and looked down at him with absolute freezing indifference. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was a document Robert Mitchell had successfully acquired during our extensive financial audit of Terrence's life. I held the paper out over the glass railing and simply let it slip from my fingers. The paper fluttered slowly through the warm morning air and landed gently on the wet grass right next to Terrence's face. I calmly instructed him to read it before he made any more ridiculous, arrogant demands about his financial future. Terrence struggled against the guards just enough to read the bold corporate letterhead facing up from the grass. It was an official termination notice from his own employer. The corporate executive board at his prestigious company had run a routine quarterly financial background check on all management staff. They easily discovered his massive defaulted personal loans, his recent vehicle repossession, and the highly public civil foreclosure proceedings currently destroying his primary residence. Because he worked in a highly sensitive financial sales sector, his severe personal bankruptcy made him an extreme corporate liability and a major security risk. The letter clearly stated that he was officially fired effective immediately, and that he was entirely stripped of his corporate severance package due to a severe breach of professional financial conduct. Terrence stared at the termination letter on the grass, his eyes wide with absolute crushing horror. The very last pillar of his fake, arrogant life had just been violently kicked out from underneath him. He had absolutely no wife, no house, no car, and now he had no career. He looked back up at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish pulled completely out of the water. The aggressive, screaming entitlement completely vanished from his eyes in a single second. It was instantly replaced by a hollow, terrifying emptiness as the true reality of his permanent poverty finally set in. I did not offer him a lifeline. I did not throw him a rope. I did not invite him inside for breakfast to talk about his feelings. I simply looked at the head security guard holding him down, gave a short, dismissive nod, and calmly turned my back on the front yard. I told the guards to throw the trespasser back over the iron gate and to immediately call the local police dispatcher if he ever stepped foot near my property again. As I walked back into the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my bedroom, the loud, agonizing screams of my son echoed across the serene lake. He was physically dragged by his expensive, ruined collar and forcefully thrown out onto the hard asphalt street, leaving him completely and utterly destroyed by the consequences of his own terrible actions. Terrence limped back to his dark, powerless suburban house late that afternoon, his expensive suit torn and covered in dirt from being violently thrown onto the asphalt outside my private gates. He had walked for several miles along the side of the busy highway because his smartphone was completely dead and his leather wallet was entirely empty. He unlocked his front door with a trembling hand and collapsed heavily onto the living room sofa, completely exhausted and utterly defeated by the brutal reality of his situation. The air inside the house was incredibly thick, stagnant, and suffocatingly hot because the utility company had shut off the central air conditioning the night before. He closed his eyes, desperately hoping the absolute silence of the dark house would finally bring him a few miserable hours of sleep so he could figure out a plan the next day. But the universe was absolutely not finished collecting its massive debts. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a series of incredibly loud, aggressive knocks violently shook the thick wooden front door. Before Terrence could even push himself up from the leather sofa to see who was outside, the heavy brass lock clicked loudly and the front door swung wide open. A massive county sheriff deputy, wearing a dark tactical vest and a wide-brimmed hat, stepped directly into the dark foyer, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. 2 more armed deputies quickly followed him inside, spreading out with their hands resting on their duty belts to secure the perimeter of the dark house. The final legal hammer had officially dropped on Terrence Hayes. The lead sheriff deputy turned his heavy-duty flashlight on, sweeping the bright white beam across the dark living room until it landed directly on Terrence's face. Terrence shielded his eyes from the blinding light, his voice trembling as he demanded to know why armed law enforcement officers were illegally breaking into his private residence. The deputy did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of human emotion. He simply unrolled a thick legal document prominently stamped with the official red seal of the county court. He read the formal eviction order out loud in a booming, highly authoritative voice that filled the entire room. The property had been legally reclaimed by the Mitchell & Partners Holding Company, and the current occupant was officially classified by a federal judge as a hostile illegal trespasser. Terrence jumped up from the sofa, his deeply ingrained arrogance desperately trying to mask his overwhelming panic. He yelled that this was a massive clerical mistake, claiming he had strict tenant rights and aggressively demanding a standard 30-day eviction notice. He frantically patted his empty pockets, screaming that he needed to call his high-powered lawyer to stop this illegal home invasion immediately. The deputy calmly lowered his flashlight and shook his head with a look of pure pity. He explained that a standard 30-day notice only applied to legitimate paying tenants who actually held a valid lease. Since the deed transfer had been legally and completely revoked due to the hostile action clause triggered by his own wife, Terrence had absolutely zero legal rights to the property. He was nothing more than a common squatter sitting illegally in a stolen house. The deputy looked down at his heavy tactical watch and delivered the final, crushing blow. He told Terrence he had exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever basic personal clothing he could carry in a single bag. After that strict time limit expired, he would be physically removed from the premises, placed in metal handcuffs, and dragged into the back of a police cruiser if necessary. Terrence completely lost his mind. He started running frantically around the dark house, blindly opening drawers and pulling out random pieces of clothing. He sprinted up the wooden stairs to his master bedroom, tripping over the heavy, expensive rug in the darkness. He grabbed a cheap canvas duffel bag from the closet and shoved a few wrinkled dress shirts, a pair of denim jeans, and some socks inside. He was crying hysterically, tears of pure humiliation and sheer terror streaming down his dirty, sweat-covered face. He ran into his home office, desperately trying to grab his expensive laptop, his digital tablet, and his luxury watch collection from his desk drawer. But the second deputy stepped firmly into the doorway, physically blocking his path with his massive frame. The deputy sternly reminded him that the court order strictly limited his removal to basic clothing and essential personal hygiene items only. Everything else of value left inside the house was now legally considered abandoned property, which would be aggressively auctioned and liquidated to cover the outstanding legal fees and the massive physical property damage he had recklessly caused in the basement. Terrence was forced to leave behind his expensive electronics, his custom-tailored Italian suits, and every single material possession he had proudly used to build his fake wealthy identity over the years. He dragged his single cheap duffel bag down the stairs, his shoulders slumped in absolute total defeat. The deputies marched him forcefully out the front door, pushing him firmly down the concrete steps and out onto the front lawn. As Terrence stumbled onto the overgrown grass of his front yard, a sleek premium luxury sedan slowly pulled up to the curb right behind the parked police cruisers. The dark-tinted windows smoothly rolled down. Sitting inside the comfortable air-conditioned vehicle were Chelsea's incredibly wealthy parents. They had just driven all the way down from upstate New York, arriving exactly on schedule for their planned one-month vacation at their daughter's beautiful home. They were completely unaware of the absolute chaos and total financial destruction that had completely dismantled their daughter marriage over the past 48 hours. They sat in their expensive leather seats and stared in absolute horrified silence as they watched their son-in-law being physically escorted out of his own house by 3 armed sheriff deputies like a common neighborhood criminal. Terrence looked up and locked eyes directly with his father-in-law. The older man's face twisted into a mask of pure disgust and profound disappointment. Terrence desperately tried to open his dry mouth to explain, to offer some pathetic excuse about a misunderstanding, but there were absolutely no words left to say. His father-in-law simply shook his head, slowly, rolled the tinted window back up to block out the pathetic sight, and instructed his private driver to immediately take them to a luxury hotel downtown. They drove away without saying a single word to him, completely abandoning him to his miserable fate. The lead sheriff deputy pulled a heavy steel padlock and a thick metal chain from his duty belt. He wrapped the heavy steel tightly around the front door handles, securing the lock with a loud, echoing click that sounded exactly like a prison cell slamming shut. He slapped a bright neon orange "Condemned and Foreclosed" sticker directly onto the front glass window, officially sealing the property from the outside world forever. Terrence stood completely alone on the edge of the public sidewalk, clutching his cheap canvas duffel bag tightly to his chest. Dark, heavy storm clouds had been rapidly gathering above the city all afternoon, and the sky suddenly broke open without warning. A freezing torrential downpour began to wash over the quiet suburban street in massive gray sheets. Terrence had absolutely no car, no money, no wife, no family, and no shelter. He turned his back on the $1-million home he had foolishly thrown away for a measly $1,500 in rent, and began walking slowly down the street, completely soaked to the bone by the freezing rain. His miserable night of wandering the dark city streets was just beginning, but the absolute worst humiliation of his entire pathetic life was waiting for him at the family courthouse the very next morning. The harsh fluorescent lights of the county family courthouse buzzed loudly overhead the next morning. Terrence sat alone on a hard wooden bench in the crowded hallway, shivering in the exact same damp, wrinkled clothes he had worn during the freezing rainstorm the night before. He had spent the entire night huddled under a plastic bus stop shelter, completely unable to afford even the cheapest motel room in the city. When the heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 finally swung open, he dragged his exhausted, aching body inside. Chelsea was already sitting comfortably at the petitioner table. She was wearing a flawless, highly expensive designer suit. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was expertly applied to completely hide any trace of stress or panic. She was flanked by a highly aggressive premium divorce attorney her wealthy parents had undoubtedly hired to destroy him. Terrence sat down at the respondent table completely alone. He had no legal representation, no prepared financial documents, and absolutely no dignity left. The stern family court judge entered the room, slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, and officially called the divorce proceedings to order. Chelsea, expensive lawyer, immediately launched into a vicious, highly calculated legal attack. He stood up and confidently painted Terrence as a deceptive, financially abusive monster who had intentionally hidden massive marital assets and deliberately destroyed his client's pristine credit score. Chelsea sat there playing the role of the innocent, traumatized victim, absolutely perfectly gently dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her lawyer aggressively demanded a heavily disproportionate division of their shared property, completely unaware that there was no property left to divide. He demanded that Terrence pay Chelsea $5,000 a month in permanent alimony to maintain the high-class luxury lifestyle she had grown accustomed to during their marriage. Furthermore, he demanded that Terrence take full and exclusive legal responsibility for the massive secret bank loans and the vehicle title pawn that had resulted in her luxury car being repossessed. Terrence completely lost what little sanity he had left holding him together. He jumped up from his wooden chair, violently slamming his fists down on the table. He screamed at the judge that Chelsea was a greedy, delusional parasite who had spent their entire marriage maxing out premium credit cards on luxury handbags, expensive weekend spa treatments, and lavish vacations they could never actually afford. He yelled that she was the exact reason they were completely bankrupt, and that her insane, reckless decision to turn my basement into an illegal drug den had directly caused the $300,000 foreclosure. He frantically tried to explain to the unamused judge that there were absolutely no hidden marital assets to divide because everything they ever owned was heavily financed, leased, or completely stolen from my good graces. Chelsea dropped her innocent victim act the second he insulted her spending habits. She abruptly stood up and started screaming right back at him across the quiet courtroom. She viciously mocked his ruined clothes, his terrible smell, and his pathetic homelessness. She called him a miserable failure who had maliciously tricked her into marrying a fake millionaire. They viciously tore each other apart right there in front of the judge, screaming and fighting like wild animals over the pathetic scraps of a fake empire that had already burned entirely to the ground. They argued over who got to keep a fancy espresso machine and a set of designer luggage, completely ignoring the fact that those items were currently locked inside a foreclosed house they could never enter again. The judge violently slammed his gavel repeatedly, his face turning bright red as he threatened to hold them both in criminal contempt and throw them in county jail if they did not shut their mouths immediately. Right as the enraged judge was about to order the armed court bailiffs to forcefully restrain Terrence, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung slowly open. Robert Mitchell walked confidently down the center aisle with the calm, terrifying presence of an apex predator entering a cage full of frightened mice. He was wearing a custom-tailored black suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He respectfully approached the wooden bench and handed the judge a massive stack of certified financial documents. He formally introduced himself as the primary legal representative for Mitchell & Partners, the senior priority creditor in the Hayes marital estate. Robert calmly informed the court that the two individuals currently screaming at each other over imaginary wealth actually possessed a combined net worth of negative $400,000. He presented the verified bank statements, the maxed-out credit card bills, the defaulted personal loans, and the massive judicial lien he had successfully executed the day before. He proved beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that there was absolutely no money left to divide, no property left to sell, and absolutely zero income available for alimony, since Terrence had been officially terminated from his corporate job for severe financial misconduct. Chelsea, wealthy divorce attorney, quickly reviewed the certified financial disclosures Robert had provided. The color drained from the lawyer's face as he realized his client had absolutely no assets and no possible way to pay his exorbitant legal fees. The attorney slowly packed his premium leather briefcase and quietly stepped away from Chelsea's table, effectively abandoning her right in the middle of the hearing. The judge looked over the disastrous financial ruins of their fake marriage and issued his final legally binding ruling. He firmly denied every single one of Chelsea's ridiculous demands for alimony and monthly financial support. Instead, the judge legally bound her to exactly 50% of the massive unsecured credit card debt she had recklessly accumulated during the marriage, buying her designer clothes and expensive shoes. Chelsea's legs gave out completely. She collapsed heavily into her wooden chair, gasping for air as the devastating reality of the judge ruling finally hit her. She was walking away from this marriage not with millions of dollars in settlement money, but with a mountain of toxic, high-interest debt that would permanently destroy her financial future and severely damage her credit score for the rest of her life. She buried her face in her hands and began to genuinely sob. Terrence let out a hollow, manic laugh that echoed disturbingly through the silent courtroom. Two highly arrogant people who thought they were entirely untouchable had just legally and financially destroyed each other in public. As the armed bailiffs firmly escorted the bankrupt, newly divorced couple out of the government building, Terrence had absolutely no idea that his humiliating downward spiral was about to hit the absolute bottom of the social barrel in a way he never saw coming. 2 weeks after the humiliating divorce hearing, Terrence found himself standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of a rundown gas station on the absolute worst side of the city. His tailored suits and expensive shoes were locked away in a foreclosed house he could never enter again. He was currently wearing a stiff, incredibly scratchy polyester uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too big and stained with old coffee. He had spent the last 14 days sleeping on a thin, uncomfortable cot in a crowded municipal homeless shelter, eating bland oatmeal from a styrofoam cup. Absolute desperation had finally forced him to swallow whatever tiny shred of pride he had left. He had walked into this dirty convenience store and begged the manager for a job, deliberately leaving his corporate executive history off the application. He was hired on the spot for minimum wage, placed on the grueling overnight shift, and handed a dirty mop. The arrogant man who used to confidently stride through glass corporate lobbies and boldly demand $1,500 a month for a damp basement was now standing behind a sticky laminate counter, ringing up cheap cigarettes and stale hot dogs for pocket change. The sheer physical reality of his new life was a constant waking nightmare. Terrence spent his dark nights scrubbing grimy public toilets, wiping spilled sugary drinks off the linoleum floors, and hauling heavy bags of rotting garbage out to the rusted metal dumpster in the back alley. His hands, which used to be perfectly manicured and soft, were now covered in painful blisters and harsh chemical burns from the cheap industrial cleaning supplies. He smelled constantly of stale grease and bleach. Every time the electronic bell above the glass door chimed, he flinched, terrified that someone from his past corporate life might walk in and see him in this pathetic state. But the universe was determined to wring every last drop of arrogance out of his soul. It was exactly 2 a.m. when a sleek, expensive sports car pulled up to the brightest gas pump outside. A man dressed in a sharp, custom-fitted navy blue suit stepped out of the vehicle talking loudly on his latest smartphone. He casually strolled into the convenience store, completely ignoring Terrence, and grabbed a premium bottle of imported spring water from the glass cooler. He walked up to the counter, still talking loudly into his phone about a massive real estate commission he had just closed. He casually tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the counter. The bill hit the edge of the plastic register and fluttered down onto the dirty floor right by Terrence's heavy work boots. Terrence stood perfectly still, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth actually ached. He waited for the wealthy customer to apologize and pick up the dropped money. But the man did not move. He simply paused. His phone conversation looked down at the crumpled bill on the floor and impatiently tapped his expensive leather shoe against the linoleum. He rudely snapped his fingers at Terrence, ordering the gas station clerk to hurry up, pick up the cash, and hand him his exact change because he was in a massive hurry. Terrence felt a sudden violent surge of rage boil up in his chest. A few short months ago, he would have screamed at this man and thrown the water bottle right at his head. But today, Terrence was starving, exhausted, and desperately needed this miserable minimum wage job just to buy his next meal. He slowly swallowed his pride, bent his aching knees, and reached down to the dirty floor to retrieve the crumpled piece of paper. He picked up the $5 bill, stood back up, and punched the buttons on the cheap cash register. The metal drawer popped open with a loud ding. He counted out the exact change, $3.50, and held the coins out toward the customer. As the man reached out to grab the change, his eyes finally focused on Terrence's face. The wealthy customer completely froze. He slowly lowered his phone from his ear. A wide, incredibly cruel smirk slowly spread across his perfectly tanned face. It was Julian, the exact same highly arrogant luxury real estate broker from Buckhead, who had tried to kick me out of his pristine lobby for wearing faded work boots. Julian looked Terrence up and down, taking in the oversized polyester shirt, the dirty hands, and the defeated posture. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly through the empty store. He loudly recognized Terrence as the arrogant corporate manager who used to brag about his wealth at downtown networking events. Julian leaned over the counter and whispered that he had personally sold a $2 million lake house in straight cash to Terrence's father just last month. Julian intentionally did not take the coins from Terrence's shaking hand. He simply turned around, walked out the glass doors, and drove away in his expensive sports car, leaving Terrence completely paralyzed behind the counter. The crushing realization that my massive wealth was a widely known fact in the luxury real estate world, while Terrence was currently scrubbing toilets for loose change, absolutely broke his spirit. He leaned heavily against the plastic counter, desperately trying to catch his breath. Suddenly, the small, incredibly cheap television mounted in the upper corner of the convenience store caught his attention. The local news station was running a special late-night segment on the massive surge in county foreclosures. Terrence slowly raised his head, his tired eyes locking onto the glowing screen. The news anchor was standing in front of a very familiar brick suburban house. It was his house. The heavy steel padlock and the bright neon orange condemned sticker were clearly visible on the front door. The reporter announced that the property was scheduled to be completely liquidated at the downtown public auction block the very next morning. Terrence stared at the screen, his stomach dropping into his shoes, completely realizing his final humiliation was about to be broadcast live to the entire city. The sharp echoing crack of the heavy wooden gavel striking the sounding block rang out through the crowded county auction hall at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. The massive room was packed shoulder to shoulder with ruthless real estate investors. wealthy property flippers, and aggressive corporate buyers, all hungry to snap up distressed suburban homes for pennies on the dollar. They held numbered bidding paddles in their hands, their eyes fixed intently on the massive digital projection screen at the front of the room. Standing completely unnoticed in the very back corner of the cavernous hall, hidden by the heavy shadows near the exit doors, was Terrence. He was still wearing his filthy, coffee-stained gas station uniform from his miserable overnight shift. He had not slept a single minute. He had taken 2 different public buses just to get downtown, driven by a morbid, torturous need to physically witness the final nail being driven into the coffin of his former life. On the glowing screen right above the auctioneer podium, a high-resolution photograph of his former suburban home flashed into view, complete with the neon orange condemned sticker still brightly plastered across the front living room window. The fast-talking auctioneer leaned directly into his microphone, rattling off the legal property description, the total square footage, and the highly desirable zip code. He explicitly noted the massive $300,000 judicial lien attached to the deed, warning the crowd that any winning bidder would have to assume that heavy financial burden immediately upon purchase. Despite the massive legal debt, the property was located in a premium neighborhood, and the greedy investors immediately smelled blood in the water. The bidding opened at a ridiculously low starting price of $50,000. Almost instantly, half a dozen numbered paddles shot straight up into the air. The price rapidly climbed to $100,000, then $150,000. The wealthy property flippers barked out their bids aggressively, trying to outmaneuver each other for the prime suburban real estate. Terrence watched from the dark corner, his stomach twisting into incredibly painful knots. These wealthy strangers in tailored suits were casually treating his former sanctuary, the house where he used to host lavish dinner parties and pretend to be a king, like a cheap piece of meat being violently fought over by wild dogs. As the bidding fiercely crossed the $200,000 mark, the crowd slowly began to thin out. The amateur flippers dropped their paddles, leaving only 2 aggressive corporate buyers trading rapid-fire bids back and forth across the center aisle. But sitting completely motionless in the very front row, wearing his signature immaculate black suit, was Robert Mitchell. The brilliant corporate lawyer had not raised his bidding paddle a single time. He simply sat there with his hands resting calmly on the handle of his premium leather briefcase, watching the remaining investors drive the baseline price exactly where he wanted it. When the bidding finally stalled and plateaued at exactly $240,000, the auctioneer raised his wooden gavel high into the air, loudly calling for going once, going twice. Right before the heavy wooden mallet could strike the sounding block, Robert Mitchell slowly raised his numbered paddle. He did not shout a random higher number. He calmly stood up, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and formally invoked his absolute legal right as the primary secured creditor of the estate. He announced to the entire auction hall in a booming, authoritative voice that Mitchell & Partners Holding Company was executing a full credit bid for the exact total of the outstanding debt plus all accumulated legal fees and unpaid municipal fines. The entire room went completely dead silent. The 2 remaining corporate investors immediately lowered their paddles in deep frustration, instantly realizing they had been completely outplayed by a massive legal shark. They knew they could not possibly compete with a senior lien holder who was legally permitted by the state to use the existing massive debt itself as direct purchasing currency. The auctioneer brought the heavy gavel down with a final deafening crack, officially declaring the property sold directly back to Mitchell & Partners. From his hiding spot in the dark corner of the room, Terrence watched in absolute crushing despair as the brilliant legal maneuver fully materialized right before his eyes. Because Robert was bidding using the massive debt I had strategically placed on the house 3 years ago, I did not have to spend a single extra dollar of my own liquid cash today. I had successfully reclaimed absolute legal ownership of the $1 million property I built with my own 2 hands for roughly 1/3 of its actual market value. The house was now completely cleansed of Terrence's name, wiped entirely free of any of Chelsea toxic influence, and returned exactly to where it rightfully belonged. Terrence slumped heavily against the cold plaster wall of the courthouse hallway, finally realizing the true terrifying depth of the intellectual chess match he had blindly stumbled into. He had brought a cheap plastic toy knife to a highly orchestrated multi-million-dollar financial war, and he had been absolutely slaughtered. Robert Mitchell calmly walked up to the clerk desk at the front of the room, signed the final transfer paperwork with his expensive gold pen, and slipped the fresh, clean property deed into his leather briefcase. As he walked confidently out the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, completely walking right past Terrence without even glancing in his direction, Robert pulled his sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a private number and gave a single, highly specific order. He authorized the immediate deployment of the heavy machinery. While Terrence slowly dragged his exhausted feet back toward the bus stop to return to the miserable gas station and scrub toilets for another long night, a massive convoy of heavy yellow bulldozers, industrial excavators, and massive dump trucks was already rolling aggressively down his former quiet suburban street. The heavy diesel engines roared loudly as their massive steel tracks pulled directly onto the overgrown front lawn. I did not want to live in that tainted house ever again, and I was about to completely erase the very foundation of Terrence arrogance from the face of the earth. I did not send those massive yellow bulldozers to completely level the entire property into an empty dirt lot. I sent them to aggressively tear out every single toxic modification Terrence and Chelsea had made to my original architecture. I stood in the center of the dark basement wearing my heavy steel toe work boots and a thick pair of leather gloves. This was the exact same concrete room where they had tried to imprison me for $1,500 a month. Chelsea had illegally hired cheap amateur contractors to put up a flimsy partition wall down here during her disastrous attempt to run an underground hotel. I picked up a massive 20-pound steel sledgehammer. I took a deep breath, planted my feet firmly on the concrete floor, and swung the heavy hammer with all the physical strength I had left in my 69-year-old shoulders. The solid steel head smashed completely through the cheap drywall, sending a massive cloud of white dust and broken wooden splinters flying into the air. I swung again and again, violently tearing down the physical manifestation of her extreme arrogance until nothing but the original strong structural beams remained. I spent 3 full hours swinging that hammer until my shirt was completely soaked with sweat. It was the most incredibly therapeutic physical labor I had performed in decades. Once the interior demolition was completely finished, my elite commercial construction crews moved in with incredible speed and absolute precision. I did not want to sell the house to another wealthy corporate family, and I certainly did not want to move back into a building that held such dark, miserable memories of my son and his terrible betrayal. Instead, I decided to use my vast corporate resources to completely transform the massive suburban property into something pure, powerful, and highly meaningful. I pulled the necessary commercial zoning permits through my powerful city contacts and completely gutted the entire first and second floors. We tore out the expensive granite kitchen island where Chelsea had callously demanded my rent money. We ripped up the premium hardwood floors where Terrence had proudly paraded his fake wealth. We knocked down the walls of the master bedroom where they had selfishly conspired to steal my future and lock me away. Every single trace of their pathetic, materialistic existence was systematically thrown into a massive industrial dumpster and hauled away to the local landfill. In their place, my professional crews built massive open reading rooms filled with bright natural sunlight. We installed floor-to-ceiling wooden bookshelves across every single wall and filled them with thousands of brand-new books. We brought in dozens of comfortable reading chairs, modern computer stations, and large collaborative study tables. The dark, damp basement where I had been banished was completely converted into a highly advanced youth technology laboratory, fully equipped with high-end coding computers, digital design software, and robotic engineering kits. I was turning the ultimate symbol of suburban greed into a completely free, highly advanced community library and educational center specifically dedicated to the underprivileged African-American children in the greater Atlanta area. I hired top-tier educators, brilliant librarians, and experienced youth counselors to staff the facility, paying them highly competitive corporate salaries directly out of my own pocket. Word of my massive philanthropic project spread through the city incredibly fast. I had intentionally kept a very low public profile for my entire career, quietly building my corporate real estate empire from the shadows to avoid opportunistic people. But the sheer scale of this community investment drew the immediate attention of the local media. News helicopters hovered over the property, capturing high-definition footage of the beautiful architectural transformation. Prominent city council members and influential community leaders constantly called my office, deeply eager to associate their names with such a monumental charitable endeavor. For weeks, the property was a buzzing hive of positive, productive energy. The dark, toxic cloud that Terrence and Chelsea had draped over the property was completely blown away, replaced by the bright, hopeful future of hundreds of local children who desperately needed a safe place to learn and grow. I poured over $2 million of my own liquid cash into the total renovation and the educational trust fund required to keep the facility running indefinitely. It was the absolute best investment I had ever made in my entire life. On the final day of construction, the heavy commercial landscaping crews finished planting dozens of vibrant flower beds around the wide front entrance. I stood on the pristine front sidewalk, watching a massive industrial crane carefully lower the primary signage into place right above the reinforced glass front doors. It was a beautiful, thick slab of polished white marble with deeply engraved gold lettering. It did not bear my name, and it absolutely did not bear the name of my disgraced son. The golden letters proudly read, "The Evelyn Hayes Memorial Youth Foundation." I reached into my pocket and touched the shattered photograph of my late wife that I had saved from the basement floor on the night I left. I had finally built a true lasting monument to her incredible kindness and her boundless love for children. The property was finally cleansed of all its dark history. The official grand opening ceremony was scheduled for the very next evening. It was a massive, highly publicized civic event. The mayor of Atlanta, several state senators, and dozens of prominent educational advocates were all slated to attend and deliver passionate speeches honoring the new facility. Every single major local television network sent their top camera crews and primetime reporters to broadcast the ribbon-cutting ceremony live across the entire state. As I put on my tailored charcoal suit and prepared to step out in front of the flashing press cameras, I knew exactly how wide the broadcast signal would reach. The bright, high-definition footage of my absolute triumph and my massive charitable wealth was about to be beamed directly into every single living room, every crowded sports bar, and every cheap, dirty convenience store in the entire city. The trap was perfectly set for the final act of public humiliation. The harsh fluorescent lights of the convenience store buzzed a relentless, annoying rhythm. It was the peak of the evening rush hour, and Terrence was completely exhausted. He was wearing his stiff, scratchy polyester uniform, pushing a heavy, filthy mop across the sticky linoleum floor near the front cash register. High up in the corner of the store, mounted on a rusty metal bracket, a cheap television was tuned to the premier local news channel. The volume was turned up loud to overpower the noise of the heavy highway traffic outside. A breaking news graphic flashed across the screen, accompanied by a dramatic orchestral music theme. Terrence leaned heavily on the wooden handle of his mop, wiping a thick layer of greasy sweat from his forehead. He casually glanced up at the television screen just as the live broadcast cut to a familiar, wealthy suburban neighborhood. Terrence completely froze. His heart stopped beating for a full second. The high-definition camera was panning slowly across a massive, beautifully renovated building. He instantly recognized the exact layout of the property lines and the large, mature oak trees in the front yard. But the structure itself was completely and entirely transformed. It was his former million-dollar home. The camera zoomed in on the wide front entrance where a massive, excited crowd of city politicians, local reporters, and wealthy corporate donors was gathered. Standing right in the absolute center of the frame, wearing a brilliant custom-tailored charcoal suit, was his father. I was smiling warmly, holding a giant pair of ceremonial silver scissors. Terrence watched in absolute paralyzed horror as I cleanly snipped a thick red ribbon. The crowd on the television erupted into massive cheering and loud applause. The news anchor voice echoed through the dirty gas station, praising Calvin Hayes as a deeply inspiring, silent billionaire philanthropist who had just donated millions of dollars to build a state-of-the-art youth technology and education center. The broadcast then cut to a pre-recorded tour of the inside of the building. Terrence watched the screen as the news displayed the exact spot where his heavy glass dining table used to sit. It was now a bright, beautiful reading room filled with local children laughing and reading brand new books. The camera crew walked down the stairs into the basement. The dark, damp, concrete room where Chelsea had thrown my personal clothes and hosted an illegal drug party was now a brilliantly lit, high-tech robotics laboratory. Rows of expensive computers and advanced engineering equipment lined the newly painted walls. Terrence felt the breath completely leave his lungs. I had not just taken his house away. I had completely erased his entire existence and replaced it with a permanent public monument dedicated to his late mother. He realized with crushing absolute certainty that his mother would have been infinitely more proud of this community library than she ever was of him. A younger coworker, a high school dropout who constantly mocked Terrence for his clumsy cleaning skills, leaned heavily over the front counter. The kid whistled loudly, staring up at the television screen. He pointed a dirty finger at my image on the news and loudly declared that the old man was an absolute legend. The kid laughed and started telling a customer at the register about a viral article he had just read online about the new foundation. The teenager excitedly explained that the billionaire philanthropist had completely disowned his greedy, deadbeat scam artist of a son. The kid laughed cruelly and said the son was apparently such a massive, pathetic loser that the father legally seized the house and turned it into a public charity just to teach the ungrateful jerk a brutal lesson. The teenager shook his head and loudly told the customer that he could not even imagine being such a spectacular, catastrophic failure that your own father permanently ruins your life on live television. Terrence stood completely frozen, holding his dirty mop. He felt his face burn with intense, suffocating shame. He was the massive, pathetic loser they were laughing at. His absolute humiliation was now a viral, entertaining story for strangers to mock while buying cheap cigarettes and gasoline. Before Terrence could even process the immense psychological trauma of the news broadcast, the heavy metal door to the back office violently swung open. The store manager, a short, heavily sweating man with a terrible temper, stormed out into the retail floor. He saw Terrence standing motionless, staring blankly at the television screen, and he completely lost his mind. The manager aggressively grabbed a soaking wet, filthy cleaning rag from a nearby plastic bucket and violently threw it directly at Terrence. The wet, heavy cloth hit Terrence squarely in the chest with a loud smack, leaving a dark, foul-smelling stain of dirty water right across the front of his polyester uniform. The manager screamed at the top of his lungs, ordering Terrence to stop standing around daydreaming about rich people on television while he was paying him minimum wage to work. He aggressively pointed a stubby, angry finger toward the back of the store and yelled that a drunk customer had just made a massive, disgusting mess all over the floor in bathroom stall number 2. The manager stepped right up into Terrence's personal space, his breath smelling like stale coffee and cheap tobacco. He threatened to fire Terrence immediately and throw him back out onto the freezing street to starve if that bathroom was not completely sanitized and spotless in exactly 5 minutes. He told Terrence he was the most pathetic, useless employee he had ever hired and demanded he get to work immediately. A few months ago, Terrence would have proudly punched the manager in the face and walked out the door. He would have threatened to sue the gas station and bragged loudly about his high-paying corporate salary. But today, Terrence had absolutely no fight left in his soul. His arrogant pride was completely dead, thoroughly crushed under the foundation of that new library. He slowly bent down and picked up the filthy wet rag from the linoleum floor. He did not argue. He did not try to defend his dignity because he knew he did not have any dignity left to defend. He gripped the wooden handle of his mop tightly and slowly walked toward the foul-smelling public bathrooms with his head bowed entirely in total absolute defeat. He was thoroughly broken. But the universe has a very funny way of closing a circle. As Terrence dragged his mop bucket down the narrow, dirty hallway, he had absolutely no idea that a highly unexpected ghost from his recent past was about to walk through those sliding glass front doors and deliver the final, ultimate psychological blow. The electronic chime of the front glass doors echoed sharply through the quiet convenience store, momentarily drowning out the annoying buzz of the fluorescent lights. Terrence had just finished filling his yellow plastic bucket with boiling hot water and harsh chemical bleach. He gripped the wooden handle of his mop and turned his head toward the front counter, fully expecting to see another drunk customer or an angry late-night commuter. Instead, a woman stepped out of the freezing midnight rain and walked slowly onto the dirty linoleum floor. She was completely soaked. She was not wearing a tailored designer suit or carrying a premium leather handbag. She was wearing a cheap, thin plastic rain poncho over a faded generic retail uniform. Her feet, which used to wear expensive imported heels, were shoved into scuffed discount sneakers that squeaked loudly against the wet floor. Her blonde hair was entirely unstyled, plastered flat against her pale, exhausted face by the heavy rain. Terrence completely froze in his tracks, the heavy mop slipping slightly from his blistered hands. It was Chelsea. The wealthy parents who had hired her expensive divorce lawyer had completely cut her off the very next day. They were utterly mortified by the highly public humiliation of the family court hearing and deeply disgusted by the mountain of reckless credit card debt she had secretly accumulated. They refused to let her live in their pristine upstate mansion, forcing her to return to Atlanta and fend for herself. Saddled with 50% of their massive marital debt and a completely destroyed credit score, Chelsea was entirely unemployable in any professional corporate sector. She had been forced to take a minimum wage job stocking heavy cardboard boxes at a discount grocery store located just 3 blocks down the street from this very gas station. Chelsea did not notice Terrence standing in the shadows near the back hallway. She kept her head bowed in absolute defeat, her shoulders slumped under the invisible crushing weight of her financial ruin. She slowly walked over to the coffee station, grabbed a cheap styrofoam cup, and filled it with stale black coffee. She picked up a single generic brand pastry wrapped in cheap cellophane from the discount rack and walked up to the front register. The teenage cashier, who was still highly amused by the news broadcast he had just watched, popped his chewing gum loudly and glared at her. He scanned the pastry and punched a button on the plastic register. He stated the total in a bored, incredibly rude voice. $3.45. Chelsea reached into her cheap canvas tote bag with trembling hands and pulled out a worn plastic debit card. She swiped it through the card reader. The machine immediately emitted a loud, harsh red beep. Insufficient funds. The teenager rolled his eyes dramatically and let out a loud, mocking sigh. He told her the card was completely declined and ordered her to either pay with physical cash or put the cheap food back on the shelf immediately. Chelsea's face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red. She frantically dug her shaking hands deep into her canvas bag, desperately searching for loose quarters and dimes. She pulled out a handful of dirty pennies and a few silver coins, counting them out frantically on the sticky glass counter. She was short by almost 2 full dollars. She looked up at the teenager, her eyes brimming with exhausted tears, and quietly begged him to just let her have the hot coffee because she had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift in a freezing warehouse and had to wait another hour for the public night bus. The teenager laughed right in her face. He reached out and aggressively pulled the styrofoam cup away from her, telling her that this was a business, not a homeless charity. Terrence felt a sudden, strange twisting sensation deep inside his chest. It was not love, and it was certainly not forgiveness. It was the profound, sickening realization of their shared absolute destruction. 2 highly arrogant people who used to sit in a $1 million house and ruthlessly plot to extort an old man for $1,500 were now standing in a dirty gas station fighting over $3.45. Terrence slowly stepped out of the shadows and walked up to the brightly lit front counter. The squeaking of his heavy work boots caught Chelsea's attention. She turned her head, and her exhausted eyes locked directly onto his face. She saw the oversized, stained polyester uniform. She saw the heavy mop in his blistered hand. She saw the dark, bruised circles under his eyes. The absolute shock of seeing her former husband scrubbing dirty floors for minimum wage completely paralyzed her. They stared at each other in total, suffocating silence. There was absolutely no anger left. There was no screaming, no throwing expensive jewelry, and no vicious insults. The fiery, toxic arrogance that had entirely defined their marriage had been completely extinguished by the brutal reality of poverty. Terrence did not say a single word to her. He reached deep into the front pocket of his scratchy uniform pants and pulled out 4 wrinkled, dirty $1 bills. It was the entirety of the meager tips he had managed to collect over the past 3 miserable nights. He placed the crumpled green paper directly onto the glass counter and pushed it toward the teenage cashier. He told the kid to ring up the coffee and the pastry and to keep the miserable change. The teenager snatched the money, punched the register, and aggressively shoved the coffee cup back toward Chelsea. She slowly wrapped her freezing hands around the warm styrofoam. She looked at Terrence, her lips trembling slightly, completely unable to form the words to say thank you. She simply turned her head away in absolute profound shame and slowly walked toward the large glass windows at the front of the store to wait for the night bus. Terrence stood near the counter, leaning heavily on his mop, watching the heavy rain violently wash the dirty asphalt outside. As they both stood there in the silent, buzzing convenience store, a brilliant flash of bright white LED headlights cut through the dark, rainy night. A massive, sleek black Mercedes sedan smoothly pulled up to the red traffic light directly at the intersection right outside the large glass windows. The luxury vehicle was absolutely immaculate, its dark polished paint reflecting the neon lights of the gas station perfectly. The warm, soft glow of the expensive dashboard illuminated the interior of the car. Sitting incredibly comfortably behind the premium leather steering wheel was Calvin Hayes. He was driving home from the wildly successful grand opening ceremony of the new Youth Foundation. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, listening to soft classical music, and completely at peace with the entire world. The red light was exceptionally long. Calvin casually turned his head to look out the passenger side window, staring through the rain-streaked glass of the convenience store. His sharp, clear eyes instantly locked onto the two pathetic figures standing inside the brightly lit box. He saw Terrence, his own biological son, wearing a filthy uniform and holding a dirty mop like a broken prisoner. He saw Chelsea, the incredibly arrogant woman who had tried to extort him for $2 million, wearing a cheap plastic poncho and clutching a styrofoam cup like it was her only possession in the world. Terrence and Chelsea both realized he was looking directly at them. The immense, crushing weight of the contrast was absolutely devastating. On one side of the thin glass was a billionaire philanthropist sitting in a warm, luxurious fortress of his own making. On the other side were two entirely bankrupt, defeated failures trapped in a cold, dirty prison they had dug with their own greedy hands. For one brief, agonizing second, Terrence placed his hand against the cold glass window. A pathetic, desperate sliver of hope flared in his chest. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, seeing them in this state of absolute rock-bottom misery would spark a tiny ounce of fatherly pity. He hoped the door of the Mercedes would open. Calvin did not smile. He did not frown. He did not show a single microscopic trace of anger, sadness, or pity. He looked at them with the absolute terrifying indifference of a man looking at a pile of discarded trash on the side of the highway. They were no longer his family. They were no longer his problem. They were simply the ghosts of a highly toxic past he had completely and permanently erased. Calvin slowly reached down to the door panel and pressed a single silver button. The dark, heavily tinted passenger window smoothly and silently rolled up, completely cutting them off from his sight, shutting them out of his world forever. The traffic light turned a bright, brilliant green. The powerful engine of the Mercedes purred softly, and the luxury sedan glided smoothly away into the dark, rainy night, leaving Terrence and Chelsea completely alone to face the absolute miserable consequences of the rest of their ruined lives. The rain finally stopped just before sunset the following evening. I sat comfortably on the heavy wooden porch swing of my $2 million lake house, listening to the gentle sound of the water lapping against my private dock. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple. I reached out and picked up a heavy crystal glass from the small side table next to me. I took a slow, quiet sip of 20-year-old imported bourbon, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. The absolute silence of the property was incredibly peaceful. There were no aggressive footsteps stomping on the floorboards above my head. There were no arrogant voices demanding my hard-earned money. There was only the quiet, gentle breeze rustling through the tall pine trees. I thought about the pathetic scene I had witnessed through the rain-streaked glass of that dirty convenience store the night before. I saw my own biological son scrubbing a sticky floor in a stained polyester uniform. I saw the woman who had proudly slapped a $2 million extortion demand on my lawyer desk, begging a teenage cashier for a cheap cup of stale coffee. A weaker man might have felt a sudden pang of guilt. A foolish father might have stopped the car, stepped out into the freezing rain, and offered them a warm bed and a hot meal simply because they shared his last name. But I am not a foolish man, and I absolutely do not carry even a single ounce of guilt in my heart. Blood is a biological accident, but respect is a daily choice. Terrence and Chelsea made their arrogant choices every single day when they looked down on my faded work boots and treated me like a burdensome stray dog in my own home. They dug their own financial graves with their bottomless greed, their toxic entitlement, and their completely fake luxury lifestyle. I did not push them into absolute poverty. I simply stopped being the silent financial shield that protected them from the brutal consequences of their own terrible decisions. I took back exactly what belonged to me, and I let the cold, unforgiving reality of the real world handle the rest. They wanted to charge me $1,500 a month to breathe the air in a dark basement. Now they cannot even afford to buy themselves a single hot meal. The universe has a flawless accounting system, and their massive debt was finally collected in full. Tomorrow morning I will wake up early and drive my pickup truck to the construction site of a new commercial plaza my company is developing. I will wear my scuffed steel toe boots and my faded canvas jacket. I will drink cheap coffee from a thermos and shake hands with the bricklayers and the carpenters, because those are the men who understand the true value of honest hard work. I do not need tailored suits or expensive imported sports cars to prove my worth to anyone. I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what I have built. I took another slow sip of my bourbon and looked out across the shimmering water. I felt a deep, profound sense of pride replacing the heavy betrayal that used to weigh down my chest. The $1 million suburban house that was supposed to be my relaxing retirement sanctuary had temporarily become my prison, but I had successfully transformed it into a permanent beacon of hope. Right now, dozens of young, underprivileged children were sitting in bright, safe reading rooms discovering their potential. They were learning advanced computer coding in the exact same concrete basement where I had been violently banished. I took the absolute worst, most toxic chapter of my entire life and rewrote it into a beautiful, lasting legacy honoring the memory of my late wife. I completely removed the cancerous tumor of my ungrateful son from my family tree and planted a massive garden of opportunity for children who actually deserve it. I have learned a very harsh but incredibly valuable lesson over these past few months. You cannot buy loyalty, and you cannot negotiate with toxic narcissism. When people show you exactly who they are and how little they value your presence, you must believe them the very first time. You must never allow anyone to diminish your worth or hold your peace of mind hostage, regardless of how closely they are related to you. If you have to burn a bridge to save your own life, you strike the match and you never look back at the flames. Today, I am 69 years old, and I have never felt more incredibly free, wealthy, and truly alive. My mind is sharp, my heart is at peace, and my corporate empire continues to grow stronger every single day without the heavy parasitic weight of ungrateful relatives dragging it down. They genuinely thought they could take my $1,500 and permanently strip me of my dignity. They thought I was a weak, exhausted old man who would simply bow his head and surrender to their arrogant cruelty. Instead, I legally and systematically dismantled their entire fake universe. I took back my property, I took back my wealth, and ultimately I took back complete control of my own life. Have you ever had to clean out highly toxic garbage from your own family circle? Have you ever had to stand your ground and teach an arrogant relative a brutal lesson in respect? Let me know your personal stories in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. If you found my story satisfying, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next video. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that sharing the same blood does not give anyone a free pass to disrespect your boundaries or blindly exploit your hard work. Society constantly teaches us that family is absolutely everything, and that we must endure endless abuse simply because of a biological connection. That is a dangerous lie. True family is built entirely on mutual respect, deep gratitude, and genuine care. Walking away from a highly toxic relative is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. You must let them sink under the crushing weight of their own terrible choices while you fiercely protect your own peace. If you agree that respect must be earned and toxic family members belong in the past, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories.